What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What if AZULA found a Chad boyfriend? AU Avatar, The Last Airbender, Part 6. If you enjoy this type of content, please gracefully strike the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Remember to check out the original story linked in the description. Without further ado, let's get into the legend of the man who tamed AZULA. Finding Zuko after he blindsided Katara and absconded with Aang had been surprisingly easy. It seemed that the relentless firebender had fallen into a thin and hollow ice sheet and knocked himself out from the fall. Aang had just regained consciousness when ATLA landed, and Katara wasted no time in blubbering her apologies to the airbender. Aang quickly reassured Katara, and then directed their attention to a coming danger. "We need to get to the oasis. The spirits are in trouble." But of course the soft-hearted guy had to insist on taking an unconscious Zuko along. Sokka regretted cutting through the rope the prince used to bind Aang. But at least the shorter lengths were enough to tie up his wrists and ankles. Plus, Katara was around to freeze him if he decided to be all fiery again. "No," at Aang's horrified whisper, Sokka, Katara, and you crowded to the front and saw a group of Fire Nation soldiers advancing on the oasis. Even at this distance, the unmistakable arrogant swagger of Zhao could be identified. "We need to stop him." Appa yip yip. As fast as the air bison was, they could not reach the admiral in time to stop him from crouching by the spirit oasis and reaching his arms into the waters. Another group of Fire Nation soldiers did it for them. "Admiral Zhao, you must stop this foolishness." Iroh kept an even, authoritative voice as he stepped out of the same tunnel the admiral used. Zhao rose up on his feet and immediately fell into a stance, his wet hands steaming up immediately. The firebender squad behind him followed suit. "Prince Iroh, why am I not surprised to discover your treachery? I'm not the one hiding his true agenda for this invasion, Zhao. Now cease this." The admiral scowled, gesturing with his eyes towards the pool of water. "Cease. Once I take out the moon spirit, I will be a legend. The Fire Nation will for generations tell stories about the great Zhao, who darkened the moon." As he continued, Zhao broke from his stance, using his arms to gesture wildly instead. "They will call me Zhao the Conqueror, Zhao the Moon Slayer, Zhao the Invincible." Iroh frowned and began walking towards the megalomaniacal admiral, arms still by his side. "No, Zhao. The Fire Nation needs the moon too. We all depend on the balance." "You and your fear of the spirits, Iroh," Zhao sneered contemptuously. "We do not need the moon. Only the ocean spirit needs to live. With the moon gone, the water tribes will be defeated." "Zhao, don't." The arrival of the Avatar redirected the Admiral's attention and allowed Iroh to get closer. While the prince kept up a facade of steely calmness, his heart quickened when he spied Zuko's form atop the sky bison. "Destroying the moon won't hurt just the water tribe. It will hurt everyone, including you. Without the moon, everything will fall out of balance. You have no idea what kind of chaos that will unleash on the world." "He's right, Zhao," Iroh reasoned again. "Don't do this. This is my destiny." Zhao fell into a combat stance again, and with his soldiers he seemed ready to launch himself at the Avatar. A rustle of metal and cloth drew everyone's attention, and a squad of similar, but more appropriately sized, attired soldiers, along with Colonel Hua, Admirals Dayong and Gao Ning, and General Tachi emerged from the same tunnel Iroh and Zhao came from. That so many officers managed to sneak up on Iroh back at the tunnel entrance had worried the old prince. He didn't like the blatant evidence that his senses were yielding to old age. Seeing the commanders, Zhao relaxed a little, while the Avatar's party tensed up. "Ah, commanders. Good. With your help the Avatar will stand no chance." Admiral Dayong answered on their behalf by shaking his head. Judging from Colonel Hua's scowl, she was too disgusted to form an appropriate reply, while Admiral Gao Ning and General Tachi were too dreadfully disappointed at the realization that the man they had supported had turned out to be insane. "No, Admiral, we will not be party to your madness. Please do not abandon reason. Heed Prince Iroh's advice and stand down." I am surrounded by short-sighted traitors. Fine. Your corpses will be another step to my ascension. Zhao redirected his stance towards the commanders, while his men faltered in confusion. It was General Tachi who spoke next. Have you truly lost all reason, Admiral? You're the one who's too afraid and blinkered to know true glory, you cowardly leech. Such impudence. As the Fire Nation factions faced each other down, Iroh noticed off to the side the sheer confusion in the Avatar and his companions at the turn of events. It was a good sign. That the boy didn't simply wash everyone away meant he could be reasoned with once this was done, or that he was smart enough to let two enemies break each other down before coming in to clean up the remains. With a raised hand, the smallest firebender of the commander's group stepped to the front, the uniform poorly fitting on his smaller frame. Admiral Zhao, it seems that you are set in your quest for delusional glory. Who are you to judge me? The admiral snapped, already antagonized to his limits. Zhao's hands clenched into fists as he snarled, and the soldiers around him backed away when Xing's grinning face was freed from the helmet and faceplate. I'm a Firestarter, twisted Firestarter. All of this was getting wilder and wilder by the minute. First Zhao shows up, not for Aang, but to kill the moon spirit, and then another group of high-ranking Fire Nation soldiers shows up to try and stop him. And now the kid with the dragons turns out to be a firebender, and a Fire Nation soldier at that? I feel way out of my league here, Sokka declared, actually earning looks of agreement from Aang and Katara. Colonel Xing, Zhao hissed. The boy took wait. What? Xing? He can't be that Xing? But Sokka felt the chill air rushing into his mouth as his jaw dropped and his mind reeled. The boy took step after step towards Zhao with all the confidence of a wolf stalking a grounded puffin seal. As first royal champion, I hereby declare you traitor to the Fire Nation. He paused to glance back to the other Fire Nation officers, and then Iroh. Do I have any objections? Heads were shaking, and nobody spoke up, not even the scarier-looking Fire Nation adults. Your words mean nothing, boy, Zhao retorted, and stomped a foot to ground himself in preparation for a fight. Your forked tongue will do nothing here, charlatan. Xing didn't seem impressed by Zhao's threat, and instead glanced at the soldiers behind the admiral. You have two options. Surrender and maybe seek a chance at leniency. Or join this traitor's FA dash. More noise from where the Fire Nation soldiers came from signaled the hasty arrival of Chief Arnuk and his warriors, adding more confusion to the scene. Invaders! How dare yo dash? The boy cut the chief's words short with a dismissive wave of his hand without breaking his gaze from Zhao. Relax, we're not here for you. He took another step at the admiral, and Sokka felt like the air between boy and admiral grew both colder and hotter at the same time. I'm here to make amends for the Fire Nation's mistake. Zhao let out a snarl as he finally acted, both hands punching out a massive fireball. Xing casually skipped out of the way, and the flaming projectile was deflected by the other firebenders behind him. And then he became a blur of motion, diving towards the admiral who was still drawing back to deliver another attack. A glint of metals flashed out, and Zhao cried out in pain as Xing slipped behind him, and in a fluid, ruthless motion jammed a dagger under each armpit. A hard kick to the back of his legs sent the admiral down to his knees, but the boy grabbed Zhao by the top knot to stop him from falling over. Zhao, the boy declared coldly as he looked down at his captive, for the crime of deceiving the Fire Lord, for the crime of wasting Fire Nation lives in a misleading campaign, for the crime of threatening the very existence of the Fire Nation. I, Colonel Xing of the 11th Royal Regiment Dash, O spirits, it really was that Xing, first royal champion of the Fire Nation. Hereby sentence you to death. Still standing behind him, Xing held Zhao's face in both hands. The admiral tried to struggle, but it quickly stopped, and he screamed as smoke began to rise where Xing's hands met his face. The boy colonel looked up towards Chief Arnuk, and then the Fire Nation commanders. To prevent your madness from infecting others in the future, the reports from both sides of this invasion will say that Admiral Zhao, in his eagerness to pursue his plan, slipped off an icy path and fell into the sea. It was a disappointing revelation to the officers that witnessed it that the vaunted admiral couldn't actually swim, and promptly disappeared into the cold depths. And unfortunately, he took the scroll carrying his plans, the plans he paranoidly kept only to himself with him. Beyond the rippling of water, the muted sounds of combat outside, and Zhao's groans of agony, nobody made a sound. The commanders and Iroh looked among themselves, while Chief Arnuk glanced at his men. For their part, Sokka traded confused looks with Aang and Katara, and received a shocked realization from you. Hopefully she'll fill him in later. After a moment, the adults from both sides began to give slow nods, and Xing looked back down at Zhao with a grim frown, though his voice betrayed malicious glee. Do you understand, Zhao? No one outside of this sanctum will know of what you've tried to do today. You will be remembered as the fool that doomed this invasion by accidentally killing himself. You will be the admiral who failed the Fire Nation by being too overconfident and glory-hungry to trust anyone other than himself. A far better lesson to pass on. Sokka shuddered as he swore he could almost taste the satisfaction in Xing's words. Worry not. I will give your family ample warning before the Fire Lord receives the news, so that they may officially disown you and flee the home islands before being unfairly subject to his wrath. Zhao struggled again, but again he stopped as more smoke sizzled out from underneath Xing's hands. And then Xing opened his mouth. No, wait! Aang yelled, but his intercession was ignored. Xing's mouth opened wide, and Sokka could see Zhao's face twisting into an expression of terror at the realization of what's coming. The boy's leg on the back of one knee kept his struggles from amounting to much, while his wounded arms flailed uselessly. Sokka instinctively took a step back, covering you and Katara as he did so, when he saw the glow coming from Xing's mouth. And then a burst of blinding light, accompanied by the roar of fire, made the teens turn away with yelps of surprise. The cries of alarm from the other parts of the oasis told him that most, if not all, of the adults were also surprised by the literal breath of fire. Squinting hard for a peek, Sokka noted Zhao's silhouette being cut through by a beam of white fire, the infamous blinding fire of the scorpion dragon. It was over in a matter of seconds, and the ambient light quickly dropped to normal levels. The darkness returned to his closed eyelids, and Sokka could open his eyes and remember that there were more colors than white. Sokka felt weak in his stomach, as the first thing his eyes were fixed on was the smoke-wreathed Xing with a hand on either side of Zhao's shoulders. The man's head, neck, and pretty much everything in a straight line down was missing, disintegrated away by the intense flame. The ground underneath Xing was a blackened ruin. Katara's face took on a greener tint. Aang looked no better, and he was holding on tightly to Sokka for support. Sokka himself fought down the urge to run to a corner to heave, though his gaze was still fixed on the grisly sight seen. The young warrior noted the aghast and disturbed looks of both Fire Nation and Water Tribe fighters. The scorpion dragon let the remaining 2/3 of Zhao fall away from each other onto the ground, and then walked rather stiffly towards the oasis. That snapped the gang out of their revulsion, but before they could intervene, Xing surprised them by kneeling before the pond and saluting the spirit fishes with hand in fist and head bowed. I apologize for the misaction of my former colleague, and for allowing him to sully your domain. His voice was sharp, precise. I hope you both can find it in yourselves to forgive me and my compatriots for not intervening sooner, and understand that the fool stood alone in his idiocy. Sokka was about to wonder what new kind of madness was this. But then he remembered the rumors that the scorpion dragon was touched by the spirits. So Xing kneeling reverentially to the moon and ocean spirits might not be too far-fetched after all? Maybe. As if to prove Sokka's confused thoughts correct, Aang suddenly went slack and his tattoos glowed. The airbender took a step forward to speak in a voice that was clearly not his own. We accept your apology, interloper. It was a voice that was both calm and strong, like a fast, smooth tide on a clear day. Yet there was a hint of dark anger in it, and Sokka couldn't get the picture of a wild maelstrom out of his mind. Even if he was an airbender, it was weird seeing Aang move so fluidly. The avatar seemed to float across the ground and literally walked on the oasis water to stare at Xing, nodding once with an authority Sokka never once saw Aang possess. The fact remains that you saved my beloved from a heinous end, and the consequence you meted out to the fool satisfies us. The possessed Aang then crouched in a familiar waterbending stance, and the oasis swelled up around him. Xing remained unmoving at the display, even as Aang's tattoos flared and his voice. This time the words that left Aang were crystalline in its clarity, and carried a light, ephemeral quality to it. Disturbingly, it also sounded not too dissimilar from you. For your service, you will be rewarded accordingly, even if you are the foe of our guardians. Aang's arms moved in a circular, flowing motion, and the oasis waters surged up. Rather impressively, Xing remained unmoving right until the unnatural waves slammed into him and engulfed him in a bubble. Even from this distance, Sokka could tell that the other boy was doing his best to keep calm as the water rushed all around him and began to glow to the same intensity as Aang's tattoos. And then the scorpion dragon began to tremble, and then flail as primitive instincts kicked in. Sokka's guts twisted once more as he saw the familiar, agonizing patterns of a person struggling futilely as they drowned. Shing writhed in the glowing sphere of water, the last air bubbles leaving him barely visible. Off to the side, the soldiers were all left stunned on their feet, save for a group of helmeted firebenders who were kept from advancing towards Shing by an explosion of icy spikes all around them. Katara was equally entranced by the scene, as was Yu, who was still pressed against Sokka for support. It was a shame that the current situation was such that he couldn't appreciate the moment. Shing was left in the water bubble for several long seconds, before the glowing receded, and the current inside slowed. With a jerk of Aang's arms, the water rushed back into the oasis, leaving the scorpion dropping unceremoniously onto the ground, where he proceeded to brace himself on all fours and vomit water. "May we never meet again, interloper," Aang did not say, and then he backtracked to the edge of the oasis and stopped glowing. A now confused Aang gave a confused hup as he returned to his body, and Sokka could only give him a helpless shrug. Shing got up after hacking and coughing all the water out of his lungs, and stared down at his own hands for a couple of seconds before the edges of his lips tugged upwards into a smile. Then he turned his attention to the Fire Nation group, offering a nod to the squad still struggling against the ice spike barricade that calmed them down for some reason, and then turning to Chief Arnuk and the Water Tribe warriors who were caught between awe and hostility, before finally landing his gaze on Sokka and his group. The tense atmosphere was banished when Aang seemed to finally come to a realization. "Hold on, you're the Fire Nation's Scorpion Dragon." Shing gave a faint, annoying smirk. "I suppose we should talk. Perhaps we should signal the withdrawal before night comes." At Shing's unsubtle hint, Iroh gave a nod and turned to the awestruck commanders to get them into order. Though technically out of the chain of command, being the commanding admiral's military advisor, and a prince at that, gave him enough pull for his orders to be respected. While the admirals and general promptly obeyed with occasional glances over their shoulder towards Shing, Colonel Wa took a bit longer, and instead spent several seconds staring with unabashed wonder at the younger colonel before she left the sacred cove. The boy didn't seem much changed from being immersed in the spirit's waterbending, though Iroh did notice Shing seeming a bit more elated now. Perhaps it was a more subtle blessing that was imparted to him? "If you don't mind," Shing posed to the Avatar, gesturing towards the top of the air bison milling about with uncertainty behind him. "Could I request for the return of Prince Zuko? The news of his death has been exaggerated, it seems." Whatever spell that held the young group was fully banished with those words, and the Avatar stepped forwards with his staff at the ready. "Katara, Princess Yu, get behind me and don't look at him." That confused Iroh as much as it did Shing, who tilted his head to one side. The Water Tribe boy with that group came to a realization and also got in front of the girls with arms spread out protectively, as if to ward them from an invisible force. "Cover your ears too. We don't know how his woman-stealing weapon works." Woman-ste-dash, Shing looked utterly baffled, until something seemed to click in him, and he let out a loud sigh. Iroh thought he heard the young colonel mutter out two words as he wearily pinched the bridge of his nose. "Damn you, Mosey." The remaining squad of soldiers with him responded to the muttering with tensed shoulders and awkward coughs. They were holding back laughter, Iroh realized, though he didn't know exactly why. The Water Tribe adults closed in warily, whalebone spears and water orbs readied. Shing glanced at them, and then raised his open palms at them. "Hey, I'm not here for any more killing or fighting, all right? I just want to talk and recover the prince. There's no women stealing whatever on me. You think we'll trust you that easily?" The waterbending girl spat. "We know what you do, Scorpion of the Fire Nation." Shing gave Iroh an exasperated look, and then sighed again, more theatrically again, before returning his attention to the Avatar's party. "I just offed the guy who actually came here to kill the moon spirit, and the spirits here kept me alive instead of picking one of many options they had to snuff me out. That gives me some leeway, doesn't it?" The adult warriors lowered their spears a little at the reminder of Shing's encounter with the ocean and moon spirits, and the Avatar's aggressive stance faltered, but his staff did not lower. "Freaking stupid." Iroh heard the colonel mutter again, and decided to step in. The Avatar and his friends were wary of Shing's reputation, so perhaps they might be less hostile towards him. Please, Colonel Xing does not mean for any further hostility here. Despite his monikers, he is a man of his word. The Water Tribe boy interjected with an accusatory finger flying out. Yeah, right, the only word he keeps is to threaten Earth Kingdom villages and towns. Iroh winced. Perhaps emphasizing the 11th's more brutal reputation is coming back to haunt young Xing. The prince tried again, gesturing towards the pond with a hand. If you cannot take his word, then take the approval of your spirits. They saw it fit to praise him for his deed. That gave the group pause, enough for the adults to reach them and form a protective line, while a more ornamented Water Tribe warrior rushed towards the non-bending girl, the princess, for a tight hug. Father and daughter. Iroh realized upon seeing the concern and relief on both of them. Xing collected himself and adopted a more formal tone as he ignored the avatar and looked at the adult warriors instead. Please, at least allow me to barter for Prince Zuko. The chief slowly let go of his daughter and gently pushed past the line of spears and ice to step forwards. You're Xing of the Defiant 11th? At Xing's nod, the man gave a thoughtful frown. I've heard of you. To Iroh's surprise, and the surprise of many of the warriors and the entirety of the Avatar's group, the man gave a bow that passed off decently for a Fire Nation show of respect. I thank you for Siku and his group's return. Surprise flashed through Xing too, but he quickly recovered. I'm glad they made it back. Unharmed, hopefully? The Water Tribe chieftain gave a grateful nod. It seems that we owe you for your mercy as well as what you've done today. Mercy? The waterbending girl echoed, as if unable to comprehend associating the word with Xing, but he's the scorpion dragon. He killed hundreds, if not thousands. The annoyance in Xing's voice was palpable. The venerable King Bumi still has a higher body count than me, I'm sure. Who's Siku? The boy Sokka asked as the avatar and the waterbender girl bristled, to which another warrior, an older waterbender, replied. A renowned warrior. He's out at the walls right now. Quite some years ago, he led one of the larger groups of volunteers to aid the Earth Kingdom against the Fire Nation. We thought them lost after receiving news of a great defeat. But then years later, Siku and most of his group returned on a Fire Nation boat. The waterbender paused, and then nodded at Xing, cunningly donated by the soldiers of the 11th. A deception to mask their execution demanded by another Fire Nation commander. Supposedly, General Ishu, Xing helpfully provided. Didn't like how big our prison caravan was getting, so he asked us to call the worthless ones. Water Tribe fighters made for poor ransom and couldn't heal, so he trailed off with a shrug. They spoke of their time under the 11th's care, the chief continued. They spoke of unexpected and generous courtesies, of your brutal yet honorable ways. He stared at the colonel for a second. Since you've ascended to the rank, I take it you're superior. Xing stiffened, but his words were neither defensive nor heated. He passed in his sleep, the diseases of growing old in the battlefield catching up to him. My condolences, the warrior offered. It was a peaceful thing, thankfully. Iroh heard the truth in the young colonel's voice, and he felt relieved that his old friend did not suffer in his final moments. Mutual respect was exchanged through silent looks, and then the warrior turned to the avatar. Avatar Aang, I can vouch for the young man's character. That he intervened here is a testament that the 11th has not strayed from their honorable conduct. But he's responsible for the deaths of thousands, young Aang argued. The old waterbender snorted. All soldiers who want to survive a battlefield will have blood on their hands, and their leaders would be wading through it if they wanted to win or keep their own men alive. Our waterbenders last night have taken hundreds of lives, and our warriors have their own tallies throughout this long war. It'll be no different for the warriors of the Earth Kingdom. The waterbending girl was not convinced. He's a monster who's happy to starve Earth Kingdom armies to death, or slowly kill them by poisoning their food. The grim looks she received from the Water Tribe adults stopped the girl from damning Xing any further. Unfortunately, those are effective tactics in war, Katara, the waterbender said. Tactics we've carried out ourselves in the past, and will do so again if we have to. But enough, Avatar Aang interrupted, his mind seemingly made up as he glared at Xing. You're not a friend, but you saved the moon and ocean spirits. Sokka, go get Zuko. I thank you for your consideration, Xing replied with a formal bow, and Iroh and the squad joined along just to show that the gesture was earnest. Zuko was only starting to wake as he was carried off the air bison and brought towards the Fire Nation party. Thankfully, he didn't seem to be harmed too badly. Iroh held back the urge to immediately see to his nephew. Formalities were what was keeping the Avatar and the Water Tribe talking right now. The invasion force will be turned back, Shing said with certainty. Blame will be distributed and bartered about. Investigations will be conducted. If things go well, the Northern Water Tribe will not suffer another invasion for a long, long time. The girl Katara remained bellicosely unimpressed. You sound so sure of it. Iroh caught the soft sigh, leaving the boy. Considering the material and human losses sustained in just 2 days, Fire Nation sailors and soldiers, and whole ships that cannot be retrieved from the depths of the sea, it'd be politically and strategically unsound to push for another feudal invasion while people still remember this one. If that's what you think, then why are you here? Shing gave a thin smirk as he glanced at Iroh. Who'd believe me if I killed Zhao before he tried what he did here? Nobody, the prince replied aloud with a shake of his head. You'd be severely punished for turning on an admiral. If you were caught. Iroh paused for a second as the implications slowly streamed into his head. You'd give Zhao's faction more legitimacy by making a martyr out of him. The resolve of the invasion leaders would be far more dogged, which would make the fighting worse. The need to win would drive the commanders into taking more brutal tactics. The conquest might turn into a razing instead, and by making a show of Zhao's true intentions, even to a small group of witnesses, all that legitimacy would fall apart. The traditionalists would have to scramble to regain lost prestige and honor after this, giving AZULA more space to spread or solidify her influence. As expected of the terrifying prodigy, Shing seems to have calculated his moves rather well. While the Avatar's young group were skeptical, the Water Tribe warriors took in the words with grim understanding. No, you could have found a different way. Nobody had to die. Shing fixed the Avatar with a harsh glare. When you've dealt with more in the world of politics and warfare, come back and say that again with all this naive honesty. Predictably, Katara came to the Avatar's defense. Your world is nothing but murder and destruction. We want no part of it. Neither do I, Shing replied wearily. He shook it off and returned his attention to the Water Tribe warriors. I hope you can allow the consideration of not damaging the ship me and the princes will embark on as you chase the Fire Nation off your waters. Beyond political needs, Prince Zuko's sister would be glad to see him alive. The warrior nodded. We will consolidate on our breached defenses. Your fleet will be allowed to leave unmolested. Once more Shing bowed, and once more Iroh joined in. The prince also caught the look the colonel threw at the Avatar. I'll do what I can to dissuade Prince Zuko from continuing his hunt for you. We can handle him, the Airbender replied curtly. If you say so. Shing faced the Water Tribe warriors, but his eyes occasionally glanced at Sokka, and his voice became laced with hidden meaning. By the by, it should be obvious, but I'm told that the attempt to assassinate Zhao failed horribly when the leader of the group broke his cover. Dumb Fool announced himself before getting into effective range to take Zhao out. Iroh remembered the amateur attempt by a Water Tribe warrior in a Fire Nation soldier's outfit. Barely old enough to be a man, he recklessly charged at Zhao and promptly fell off the bridge's deck when the former admiral casually sidestepped out of the way. He might have survived the landing on the main deck, but not the spears of the guards around him who heard his loud proclamation. Why would he owe? Iroh saw guilty relief flash across Sokka's face, and saw something in the eyes of the young princess by his side. Then the prince reflexively began to wonder how this matchmaking played into Shing's, or the spirit's, plans. As they left, with Zuko supported by Shing's soldiers, Iroh traded whispers with the colonel. I am grateful for your arrival, Shing, but how did you know of Zhao's plan? The boy shrugged. Clues and hints. I wasn't really sure, to be frank. Then I'm glad that you took the risk to follow the spirit's guidance. Shing made a non-committal noise and then unsubtle changed topics. So, would you mind telling me how Prince Zuko's supposed death had him winding up as the Avatar's prisoner? Ah yes. Iroh gave what information he knew, along with those gleaned from Zuko's hazy memory of the ship's destruction. We have our suspicions, so Zuko decided it best to use the news of his death as a cover to continue his quest. He should have returned to Zilong, Shing muttered as he glanced back at the awake but still incapacitated Zuko. We could have helped protect him. Zuko regards you highly, the older prince said. He does not wish to dishonor himself by being a burden to you and your regiment. Shing's disbelieving look was reassuring, as was his derisive snort. I should have briefed him on being more loose with honor. Yet that is all he relies on to drive him, Iroh bluntly said, uncaring if his nephew heard him or not. Understandable, considering the circumstances of his exile. But still, he should have known by now that he has friends in the 11th Regiment, and he could come to us for aid. I'm sure we'll have the time to impress that lesson on him. Yeah, I'm having Admiral Daeyong drop us off at Zilong. I'll have our healers look over you and Prince Zuko. Me? Iroh asked, puzzled at being included. It's been a while since you dropped by, Prince Iroh. Better to get you a checkup while we can. Xing chuckled. Plus, you've been stuck with Zhao for so long. I have to be safe and see if any of his idiocy has infected you. I still don't trust him, Aang said, and Sokka had to agree with him there. This Xing guy was far, far creepier than Zuko and Zhao combined. And there was a sense that getting into a fight with him would be a very different affair to the encounters with the other two. That Sokka sighed with a relief he didn't know existed showed just how much presence the guy had. Zuko almost reeked of desperation, while Zhao was arrogant. Xing was lethal. The kind of lethal that got him dark reputations throughout the Earth Kingdom villages and towns. And yet, a nagging thought pestered Sokka. So, how come they all say he helped the Fire Lord kill the last dragons, if we saw him with 2 living ones? That brought Aang and Katara out of their debate about Xing's character with Chief Arnuk and Master Pakku. The airbender scrunched up in a heavy frown as he mulled it over, while Katara kept opening and closing her mouth like a fish to form answers. Sokka felt the pressure ease off his right arm and glanced at a confused, yet still very lovely, you. The guy was supposed to have killed a dragon, and then offered its eggs to the Fire Lord to destroy. And you saw him with live dragons, Pakku said with an undercurrent of smugness. Yeah, Aang admitted. But it's weird, isn't it? Sadly, you fully let go of Sokka as she voiced her thoughts on the matter. Maybe he was hiding them, but he killed a dragon and stole its eggs. How do you know? Pakku's smugness was very much more apparent this time. At the looks from Sokka, his sister and Aang, the master waterbender visibly preened. Everyone says he did it, but what evidence did Xing give? From what we know, the boy of the 11th has a keen talent for deception. Siku also mentioned that they do not inflict their tactics on villagers and refugees. So he's lying about all that? Why would he do that? Pakku shrugged. Who knows? Sokka found the potential answers disturbing, but he still had his doubts. So what, he's a good guy now? Oh no, it's just that you can probably trust this Xing, this scorpion, to be competent and stick to a set of rules that you could exploit if you know what they are. What kind of rules? Sokka felt the urge to smack Pakku when the waterbender smirked. Rules of war. Rules of engagement. At Aang's repulsed expression, he shook his head. Xing is right. You need to learn more about the harshness of the world before you can cast judgment as if you know all the details. But he's a killer, the airbender said weakly. Chief Arnuk stepped in. And so are we. Aang, what did you think happened when you disabled the Fire Nation ships alone? Did you think we would just leave them there to be retrieved by the rest of their fleet? Sokka felt a slight churning in his guts, but Aang and Katara took on greener hues as they digested that fact. We killed to protect ourselves from the Fire Nation, just as the Earth Kingdom does. This is not a bloodless war, Avatar. It took several seconds for Aang to close his eyes and calm his nerves to reply. But taking a life is. Sokka felt a pang of sympathy for the Avatar, even as he himself came to grips with the fact that he might have to face far more brutal violence out in the world. Zuko's chase for the Avatar had been tame, Sokka realized. The prince needed Aang alive, so he had pulled his punches. And it was a mercy that their encounter with Zhao's had been in an isolated area. Taking a life is something that should not be done lightly, Chief Arnuk said softly. But neither should it be ignored when all other options are proven to be inadequate. The Fire Nation's invasion does not allow us any other choice but to fight back and end their lives before they do the same to us. In the same vein, Zhao's madness could only be punished in one way. Katara reached out to Aang, who shook his head in full denial and glared at the adults. I won't. I can't. The glare softened and his shoulders slumped. But I understand that it cannot be avoided sometimes. The image of the remains of Aang's old mentor, Gyatso, surrounded by dozens of Fire Nation corpses came to Sokka, and he briefly wondered what went on in the air nomad's mind in his last moments before taking those soldiers' lives with him. Maybe he'll bring it up later, when Aang isn't so stressed. They all left the Spirit Oasis shortly after to witness the Fire Nation's retreat. As Chief Arnuk declared earlier, the Northern Water Tribe defenders reclaimed the broken walls and went no further, allowing the invaders to flee unmolested. Sokka couldn't help resting his gaze on the unmoving bodies littering the city streets. Blackened husks marked the victims of firebenders. Bodies draped in red and black were crushed into unrecognizable forms under piles of ice. More conventional corpses lay on the ice surrounded by pools of their frozen blood. Out by a junction, a Fire Nation soldier had been torn in half, probably from the tank hatch he was escaping from as a crystalline boulder crushed it. The Water Tribe youth took in the sight of war and contrasted it to the raids, light raids, now that he thought about it, conducted on his own tribe in the past. Losing his mother had been a major tragedy for their whole village. How great must the grieving be here, with the dozens or even hundreds of Agna Kellis fallen. Something wrapped around his hand, and Sokka turned to see Yu's sad but comforting smile. He returned it as best as it could, and felt the cold void in his core lightening a bit. A glance at Aang and Katara found them in far grimmer states. Tears streamed down the cheeks of Sokka's sister, while the young airbender was wide-eyed with horror and trembling a little. "Hey Aang," Sokka reached out. "Come on, let's go get some rest. You too, Katara. Come on," as he led them into the far more sterile royal palace. He caught the look of approval from Chief Arnuk and Master Pakku, and returned their silent nods with one of his own. Fortunately, you followed along, her hand never leaving his. It was probably the one thing giving Sokka any warmth at all as they left the scene of carnage. They remained in Agna Kele for another 2 weeks, to continue Aang's waterbending training, as well as allow their young minds to come to terms with the horrors of war. Katara bore both training and trauma with her usual stubborn determination, but Aang still awoke from nightmares occasionally. As for Sokka, he was glad that he was allowed to officially court Yu. After Han's loss was confirmed by those clearing the city and waters. It allowed him a veil of normalcy, a happy little respite from the ugliness of the world. Yu also showed a hidden strength in her that Sokka quickly relied upon as he faced his inner unease. The war is a horrible thing that forces the best people to do the worst things. I've seen the hard decisions my father had to make. I'll have to make those same decisions someday. And so will you. The two of them spent a lot of time in quiet walks or simply sitting by the walls. Sokka would listen to Yu's comforting words, and he also learned to listen harder to her pearls of wisdom. It hammered home that she was the princess of a whole city, while he was just a chieftain's son from a small, fragile village. She spoke of the long view and multi-layered intentions. When Sokka recounted his tales with Aang, her probing questions about their actions, as well as their enemies, left his mind roiling with what-ifs and occasional cringing regret. Be thankful that Zuko was keen in following Xing's wishes, she said about the incident in Kyoshi Island. The Fire Nation could have simply bombarded the village to flush Aang out, or used the villagers as hostages. That particular fact made Sokka squirm. The encounter between Suki and Zuko had implied that the Scorpion had landed on Kyoshi Island before their arrival, and somehow struck a deal with the Kyoshi warriors. A deal that made Suki and her fellows tense. And then there's the fact that relentless Zuko actually took the Kyoshi warriors' claim seriously. Sokka didn't know what the Scorpion Dragon had in store for Aang, but he didn't trust the shows of respect and consideration given so far. He couldn't, not after seeing what kind of madness can infect the Fire Nation, like it did to Zhao. For days before they left, Chief Arnuk had approached Sokka with Yu by his side. The chief wore a smile that was both sad and elated at the same time. "My daughter has persuaded me of the merits of uniting the northern and southern water tribes, and has volunteered to take the first step in that direction." Yu stepped towards Sokka with a coy smile, her brilliant blue eyes fixed on him. His heart began hammering away, and he was nodding even before she opened her mouth to offer her proposal. Their betrothal was announced to the cheers of everyone. Even Katara and Aang lit up despite their exhaustion from their training. Sokka found himself a very, very lucky man when some of the older women teased Yu, and she answered by pulling him by the lapel of his coat and pressing her lips against his. His legs almost failed him as the kiss stole away his mind. But Sokka was a brave water tribe warrior, and endured the happy little ordeal. He did not have a stupid smile on his face, contrary to what Katara and Aang accused. On the day of their departure, Sokka got to enjoy a more passionate, seconds-long kiss before he boarded the ship. Come back to me, Sokka. Yu was strong. She didn't ask him to stay with her and accepted his place as Aang's companion. Sokka swore then to do right by her. He held her hands in his, squeezing them gently for every ounce of strength he could loan from her. I'll be back, Yu. I promise. Within her private quarters in Omash's governor's mansion, Mai took AZULA's change far more dramatically than Ty Lee had expected her to. Her usual gray apathy turned into shocked surprise when the princess bowed before her and apologized in the same way as she did to Ty Lee. The former acrobat saw the minute twitches and movements in her friend that made Mai's gray aura take on more interesting hues, if only for a moment. There were tints of concern at the edges of it, as well as a larger dash of suspicion. But all in all, Mai was a roiling swirl of processing emotions. And despite all that, as I did with Ty Lee, I've come seeking your aid in looking for Zuko's attackers. The mention of Zuko unsurprisingly made Mai tense just a little, giving her aura a flash of an angry pink-orange. Anger and the reignited sparks of an old crush. Count me in. Anything to get me out of this place. For how bland Mai managed to sound. Ty Lee saw rather than hear how the words were only half honest. Her friend's subtle twitches kept sparking her aura. Mai was really out for blood. AZULA decided to spend the night in Omashu before heading to Hai Sin. Ty Lee found that the princess was surprisingly courteous to Mai's parents, considering her father's position as governor of Omashu. The tales that managed to seep out to the circus emphasized AZULA's contempt for the colonies and the way it was run, which was why she got fed up with it and decided to seize the reins of colonial minister herself. But those same rumors couldn't decide whether she was picking up the ostracized and shamed to work in the colonies out of mercy or spite. Some said she was giving disgraced officials and nobles another chance at proving themselves. Others that she was clearing the more prestigious home islands posts of Deadwood by transferring them out to the Bunas. Even as she saw the changes to the princess, Ty Lee couldn't be sure which version held true. AZULA was still sharp and cunning as ever, with an eye for detail that made her verbally flay the dockmaster for his incompetence back when they were departing the capital. And yet this was the same AZULA that stopped for a moment to crouch by a squealing tom-tom running by and produced a handkerchief from under her robes to gently wipe away his drool, tooting with disapproval as she did so. The toddler actually stopped to let her do it too, after she whispered some noises to calm him down. The princess seemed nonchalant about it, ignoring Ty Lee's and Mai's stares as she got up and ignited the stained cloth as she tossed it over her shoulder. My regiment's training captain has a brat like that, she provided as if it explained everything. Of course, being raised in a training yard, fans more well-behaved. Ty Lee noted how her royal friend practically preened like a proud cousin, the quirk of her mouth and the fondness in her eyes making AZULA's aura feel a softer shade of red. Still a snot-dribbling and noisy thing, but at least she knows how to follow drill orders. She put a lot of the new recruits to shame too. Ty Lee was so tempted to reach a hand out to Mai to help lift her hanging jaw back then. That's AZULA, right? The usually dar girl asked as AZULA walked out of earshot. Ty Lee nodded. It could be because of the soldiers she picked up. Apparently Mai had heard of the Princess Royal Regiment as well. How does investing in a group of bloodthirsty psychopaths make her this relaxed? Wait, on second thought, it makes too much sense. So she's heard of the regiment, but not the scandalous suggestions that trailed after it. Of the ruthless scorpion that caught the crown princess' eye, and then her heart. Of the favors he did, allegedly, to ensure his place by her side. The unwiser ones dared to suggest AZULA to no longer be a virgin after her adoption of the 11th. Ty Lee never saw those people again, and she didn't believe their claims. Seeing AZULA as she is now, Ty Lee was sure that her friend hadn't done anything yet, assuming there was anything to do. AZULA would have probably proclaimed herself the best at losing her virginity if that were the case, making it another show of her greatness. Though admittedly this new version of her didn't seem to be that competitive. They were preparing to leave Omashu when a messenger hawk flew in, trailing red and black ribbons. An urgent message meant for AZULA specifically. The message was hurriedly sent to her, and Ty Lee watched as the crown princess read through the scroll in silence. The way her eyebrows twitched as her eyes moved back and forth, the way her pose tensed and then relaxed. It was good news overall, good enough to make AZULA's red turn vibrant and radiant. It seems my brother is more resilient than everyone gave him credit for. Mai's eyes shot towards AZULA immediately as the princess delivered the news. Zuko's alive, freed from the clutches of the Northern Water Tribe. She clenched the scroll in her hands and set it alight. How he got there, though, is a puzzle I'll have to decipher, along with who tried to blow him up in the first place. Azula turned to Ty Lee, and then Mai. Would you both still be amenable in following me? Of course, Azula, Ty Lee eagerly said. She wanted to know more of this new Azula. I'm still in, Mai said, trying to keep a bored drawl. She was still eager to hunt down her crush's attackers. The princess gave a resolute nod. Thank you. We'll stop by Zilong first. Zuko's being dropped off there, so I'll be able to question him there. Oh, how Mai's aura turned pink at the edges. It clashed badly with gray, but at least it broke the bland monochrome. We come in peace, please. It was Kai's turn to join Ping in escorting their lieutenant colonel. And as the small group of soldiers walked into the village with forced casualness, the captain noted immediately the effects of their arrival. After dozens of such greetings, Xing and the captains had refined their lieutenant colonel's first impression into a science. As the script dictated, Mosey was without a helmet and attired only in light robes that gave hints of his bare chest and legs underneath. Kai and the rest caught the glancing blows from the intense stares of peaked peasant and refugee women. It utterly drowned out the fear and apprehension of the men and younger ladies. As Mosey came to a stop, the older womenfolk of this backwater village fearlessly walked out from the safety of their homes to gather before him. Kai couldn't help curling his lips in disgust and envy at the wide-eyed, hopeful looks they directed at Mosey. Ping was tense as usual, ready to lash out in case the ladies tried to mob him. She represented Li Ming's interest to make sure that the lieutenant colonel remained literally unmolested. A man better dressed than the others, probably the chieftain or someone similar, was struggling to squeeze his way through the muttering and appraising horde. But before he could speak up on behalf of his people, the woman who had ran from his side beat him to it. Oh my, what can we do for you? Once more, Kai found himself almost scowling at the treatment Mosey was getting. But Ping and the other female soldiers were almost bristling with disdain. As per doctrine, stoic and clueless Mosey used a mishmash of older dialogues to avoid overusing any particular opening. Forgive me of my intrusion, dear villagers. Good, he didn't just address the women. The last time he did that, they escalated the situation far more quickly than the soldiers had anticipated, and Mosey had to be taken to the healers for the sheer amount of possessive scratch marks on him. But me and my soldiers have been tasked with keeping the peace in this region. That got the women to quietly ooh and ah. And recently, we've come into a spot of trouble. The womenfolk leaned in, their attention fully devoted to Mosey. The men, though, were wary, some tugging at their wives or sisters to no avail. Kai noted the group of youths who were looking at each other skittishly. You see, we've come across reports that there are groups around here who are actively resisting the Fire Nation's administration. And unfortunately, some trails of these malcontents led to your village here. Hands went to cover mouths in faint shock, while murmurs rose from the village as a whole. Mosey kept his unwavering mask on as he swept his gaze across the women in front of him. Kai saw a few of them actually tremble from the very, very brief eye contact, and many faces darkened with heavy blushes. Now, I know you're all here honest folk, but my superiors are not too happy with me. And if I fail to find the troublemakers, I'd be sent back home without a pension or a wife. As expected, that last part caught the women's interest, and they shed their shy embarrassment to fix interested, hungry looks on Mosey. Kai and the others slowly moved forwards, ready to lower their spears if things broke down into another baying mob. So, I was hoping, rather than disgracing your village with a crass house-to-house search, if you find people might have heard of any news of such troublemakers, I'd be more than happy to personally lend an ear. Ping, who could read the mob far better than anyone thanks to her constant attendance to such meetings, brought her spear down between Mosey and the women right as they were all about to launch themselves at him. One at a time, please, ladies, she snarled. Don't worry, we've got all day. The chieftain's wife bullied her way to the front of the forming line and quickly pointed to the group of youths who were doing a bad job of sneaking away. Oh, you want to talk to the bunch of brats there, good sir, she said smugly as she side-eyed some women in particular with all the venom of an athlete sabotaging the competition. Their Sufeis and Fongfongs spoiled and useless sons, as well as Louis's brother. No surprise that the kids fled the moment her finger was pointed in their direction. Kai smirked beneath his mailed veil as he watched them leave. Sungo and his scouts would be shadowing them, hopefully all the way back to their hidden base. Before the named women could denounce the chieftain's wife, Mosey smoothly stepped in with a slow nod. "Thank you, madam. I'll have my men and women look into it." He then looked at the others and threw them a polite smile. "Now, who's next in line?" That rekindled their hope, and the rest of the soldiers had to step in to organize the queue before they surged in like a violent tide to grab Mosey. In the end, there wasn't much useful information to be gleaned, and the little detachment returned to camp exhausted and tainted in the mind. Kai didn't know how Ping kept at it every time, but maybe she'd gotten inured to a mob of ladies tearing open their robes to reveal themselves to Mosey, or bombard him with far too much private information about their competitors. Whether genital warts and deformations and pimply breasts were actually a common thing in the Earth Kingdom was something the captain of the 1st Battalion was happy to not find out. He'll probably need a few days to scour that sort of imagery from his mind. Maybe just to be sure, on his next leave he'll get some ointments for Run. As for what Mosey thought of it all, he was resigned to his fate in civilian meet and greets. The guy's cursed gift was useful in times like this, but seeing women practically abandon their spouses to throw themselves at him irritated both sexes, witnessing it in equal measure. As usual, the returning group found a waiting Li Ming by the camp entrance, and Kai and Ping led the deep, formal bows at the meek, polite young woman. "Thank you for loaning us the use of your man," Ping said. "The 11th is grateful for your sacrifice, as always, Li Ming." They then saluted her with all the formality of thanking an honored guest. Mosey had gotten used to the whole ritual by now to stay silent, especially at the fact of everyone ignoring him. Kai and the others left the lieutenant colonel with the one woman whom he actually belonged to, and then headed for the mess camp. Hopefully it isn't going to be stew today. The captain had had enough of looking at mushy meat. For better or for worse, one of the troopers came up to stop them. "Sorry, sir, but we've got guests." It was for the worst, Kai decided as he, Mosey and Ping were brought to the command tent where a woman in ostentatious red and black dress greeted them, with Toshi, Weikong and Rufin standing uncomfortably by the sides. The officers knew the look of a high-ranking official, so they bowed as one. The official was a sharp-eyed creature, reaching the later stages of her prime. Her attire was styled in traditional high court, yet enough cleavage peeked out to suggest that she wore far less underneath. Though, judging by her face, it was less skin she was showing and more layers of powder. Kai almost scowled at her naked attempt, pun intended, to impress or distract. Her eyes sparkled with calculative cunning as she swished her sleeves theatrically and stood with all the arrogance of an ignorant noble. "Ah, you've returned. Good. I am Administrator, Xu Ling, of the War Ministry. SHIT Politics. We are honored by your presence," Mosey droned out, as courtesy required. "What does the War Ministry wish of the 11th? The administrator's voice thickened, and Kai felt her gaze brushing against him and Mosey. "Nothing much. Only that the 11th Royal Regiment maintains its exemplary performance." However, Kai's spine shivered faintly at the tone she took. "Stupid Bint thinks she's being sultry and alluring. Freaking bad politics, then. That or really stupid orders were incoming. If I may have a moment of your time, Lieutenant Colonel Mosey." Mosey watched as amusement flickered across Administrator Xu Ling's features. But she otherwise remained silent as looks were exchanged with the other captains, and then they filed out to leave him alone with the Viper. He kept his neutral, stoicness on with ease as he saluted the woman again. "Administrator, what can we do for you, considering the discreet nature that you've requested?" Credit to her. Xu Ling dropped most of her act and adopted a more businesslike posture and voice. "Well, my dear officer, I'm glad that your colonel has gone off to take care of private matters. You see, it pleases me to inform you that the War Ministry under War Minister Tsu has undergone an audit of long-overlooked commendations. I thought the title was still under consideration." The administrator smiled lazily. "Only a formality at this point, I assure you. It'd be in bad taste for Minister Tsu to take the title when news is still spreading across the Fire Nation and its colonies. After all, the ministry requires a competent head to keep the war effort running smoothly." Mosey kept politely silent, signaling for Xu Ling to continue. "Now, it's come to our attention that, as far as service goes, you have accrued significant merits even before Colonel Xing's promotion. And with your current performance, the War Ministry has found it fitting to offer you a long overdue promotion." The lieutenant colonel marked out the word, offer, in particular. "What's this offer entail, if I might ask?" "Nothing too hard," she drawled. and then began pacing the tent. You see, it's come to Minister Tsu's attention that an experienced, hardened veteran like yourselves might find it restricting to work under your colonel. Mosey was surprised he could keep his mask on instead of lunging at the snake. He did have to consciously keep his hands from clenching up, though. Shu Ling kept talking, oblivious to his reaction. We can arrange for you to command a regiment, infantry, cavalry, whatever you like. And what do I need to do to earn these promotions? Mosey inquired neutrally, injecting what should be the right pinch of eagerness into his voice. I assume it revolves around Colonel Xing? The woman's smile grew wider. Very astute of you, Lieutenant Colonel. You see, it is decided that the young colonel's talents are better placed elsewhere. She walked over to Mosey and brazenly trailed a finger down his chest as she looked him in the eyes. I'd like you, my dear, outstanding Lieutenant Colonel, to convince your young colonel to accept a coming transfer to train up new divisions that's due for the southern lines. That's technically a promotion, but I thought no further operations are scheduled in the south. Other than maintaining the hold on Omashu? I knew you were a smart man, Shu Ling said with a slow lick of her lips as her gaze bore into his. The divisions, as you've so rightly noticed, will be a garrison force for the southern states. Even as he processed the information, Mosey faced the administrator and spoke in a cold whisper. That's not all, is there? It's all that you need to worry about, she replied in a sing-song tone. Until some hidden plan you have fails and bites us in the ass, he returned with the right amount of harshness. I'm a field officer, not an idiot. You want Shingon, don't you? Surprisingly, instead of trying to backtrack her words, the woman gave a pout that would have looked cute if not for all the caked makeup threatening to crack from the movement. Well, if you put it that way. Yes. Mosey fought off the urge to choke the bitch with his hands, and instead only raised an eyebrow at the administrator as she sat on the table, prompting her to continue. Plans have been made for various accidents to occur. That's all I can honestly say. At his continued silence, Shu Ling sighed, shrugging her shoulders and loosening her dress in the process. I'm sure that your regiment has enjoyed the crown princess attention, but I can assure you that the Minister Tsu is a man who treasures talents like yourself just as much, if not even more so. Mosey found it easy to passively watch the administrator spread her legs to reveal her bare, shaven coochie underneath her dress. The lady was trying too hard, he realized, especially compared to Li Ming's more natural, shy approach. Minister Tsu is willing to allow you to pick any men and women you'd wish to bring along from the 11th to your new command. Or if you'd like, you can simply keep this regiment. Won't the crown princess have something to say about that? Shu Ling crossed her legs and pouted again. Well, with her pet colonel gone. Do you honestly think the princess would give a single damn about the 11th? Don't worry, though. Minister Tsu is working on securing the 11th's royal patronage. A better one, in fact. How does the Fire Lord's Lancers sound? Mosey had to bite his inner cheek to keep his composure as the Viper leaned back to let her dress fall off her chest, freeing her breasts. They were pale, large mounds, but all it took was the image of Li Ming framed by candlelight to snuff out any sort of interest in them or their owner. I have faith that the new war minister can persuade the Fire Lord to take over the princess patronage once she inevitably drops everything to seek Xing out. If not, the whore administrator spread her legs again. I can promise that you can build a whole regiment of eager, ripe young women, all bright-eyed noble daughters, all ready to serve their colonel. Wouldn't that be just as nice? You can have me too, right now if you want. Mosey almost gagged at the idea even as she slipped a hand down to her nether regions. You can even bring your cute chef along. She can join us, join your new regiment in serving their brilliant, handsome colonel. That almost got a proper reaction from the lieutenant colonel. But the administrator was too busy closing her eyes and fingering herself before him to notice his flare of anger. Mosey ruthlessly shackled his anger and forced a bored stare at the vile woman. I'll have to think about it. She stopped her little exhibition to give him a sad pout. Are you sure? There are accomplices I need to secure before I try anything. The pout turned into another dirty smile. Ah, I see. I hope that's a good enough commitment on my part. More than good enough, the administrator drawled. I can send helpers over. Pretty ones. She winked. Don't hesitate to seek us out if you need aid in convincing the young colonel. And then she spread her legs again. Would you like to seal the deal? Mosey raised a hand and shook his head with forced slowness. The officers might get suspicious if we take too long. Of course, the administrator quickly got up and dressed, and then leaned for a soft peck on Mosey's cheek. I'll deliver the good news to Minister Tsu then. You can tell your men and women that we were discussing deployment issues. Not trusting himself any further, Mosey nodded, and waited for the woman to leave before he slumped and exhaled all his pent-up emotions in a long, fiery breath. Anger and revulsion vented out to illuminate the tent's interior for good, long seconds, interrupted only when Kai and the other captains came in. "So, what's the powdered lady want?" the captain of the 1st Battalion inevitably asked. Mosey didn't answer directly, and instead fixed the captains, his friends, with a cold stare. "After the administrator leaves, gather our earthbenders." The captains' teasing and curious looks dropped immediately as they understood the significance of the order. "We still have some captured uniforms. Have some scouts find a good place for an intercept." They nodded as one, even the relatively new Toshi accepting the orders without question. Wei Kong voiced what they were all thinking as they were about to leave. What did she threaten? Supplies from the colonies? Petitioning to send us to the east. Xing. There was a second of silence before the captains nodded again, angrier this time. "I'll ask Yama and Kylan if they want to join," Kai said, and Mosey got annoyed that he forgot about the regiment's guests. It was rude of him to leave them out. News came days later that the Earth Kingdom resistance was far more active in the region than initially thought. A group of them had brazenly ambushed the party of a home island official, from the War Ministry no less, and leaving no survivors. As the sole regiment responsible for the region, the 11th was officially reprimanded for their failure to maintain the supposed compliance that they had reported. The princess, the letter warned, would be notified. Mosey and the commanders of the 11th easily ignored that letter and focused more on the other scroll that came along with it. The invasion of the North Pole was cancelled, and with that Xing would meet the regiment back in Zilong. The 11th Royal Regiment duly waited for Colonel Koda's 31st Cavalry to take over their post before packing up and heading back to their colonial barracks. On the way, Mosey had them stop by a spot along the road, so that he and the captains could take a piss on the unceremonious grave of Administrator Shu Ling. For all the constant news from the front lines, there was actually very little happening as Suki and her squad of Kyoshi warriors got closer to it. None of the painted protectors had expected their current situation, to be honest. They'd come across a sizable refugee convoy, and as they had done in the past, the Kyoshi warriors gladly offered their aid in escorting a small town's worth of people to safety. The funny thing was, safety to them was on the other side of the border, in the Fire Nation colonies. Suki had initially wondered whether propaganda had affected these burdened folks, but then the mayor freely explained that they were fleeing from the very real threat of Earth Kingdom military officials. "They come for our men and women, our food stores, our raw material, our money. I swear, if they could, they'd take the whole town with them." That was disturbing, but as Suki had learned over the months traveling on the continent, it was far from surprising. She and her warriors had come across villages bereft of any men save for the invalid, the elderly, and those too young to run. In some encounters, the womenfolk were conscripted too, even if the Earth Kingdom did not employ women in their armies. Dark tales followed after those cases. Tales that made the Kyoshi warriors question the Earth Kingdom's status as a noble, beleaguered defender against Fire Nation aggressors. It didn't help that the Kyoshi warriors' encounter with actual Earth Kingdom military forces did not always turn out well. In some cases, the commanders and troops recognized the painted faces of the girls, and Suki found her group the disturbing focus of intense hope and awe. It was as if her squad carried the powers of the Avatar to smite the enemy. The common soldiers kept reverential distance, or came with simple offerings that made the girls uneasy, while their captains and generals would, in varying degrees of subtlety and desperation, request for the Kyoshi warriors to join them in battle. Suki knew better than to agree to such suicide missions. For all their prowess, the Kyoshi warriors were trained and equipped as defenders, not war leaders or frontline soldiers. Her encounter with the Scorpion had made that ugly fact abundantly clear. And there were only 6 of them, a fraction of a fraction needed to fight off the hundreds and thousands of the Fire Nation soldiery. The Kyoshi warriors came to the continent to gather information, not die in desperate and ultimately futile battles. At least those commanders eventually resigned themselves to her rejection and allowed the Kyoshi warriors to pass without any further issue. Those were the decent ones, showing the beleaguered resolve of the Earth Kingdom's defenders. However, there were also encounters with far less savory types. Some bands of soldiers were barely tolerable. Their gazes were clearly improper, but for the most part they only gave filthy sneers or grins, which the Kyoshi warriors tolerated as they quickly moved through such camps. The group finally agreed to stay away from any further military forces after their last meeting with a pompous and uncouth general. His troops were respectful enough, but Suki did not like the way the man and his officers looked at her or her sisters. Her skin crawled as she felt their roam across her body, and their thin insinuations threatened Suki's tolerance. Only when a captain unsubtle brushed his hands against Okuni did the Kyoshi warriors finally tire of the filthy atmosphere. Unfortunately, the general and his men did not take kindly to their sudden need to leave, and they barred the exit. Suki and her fellow warriors felt no guilt as they drew their fans and swords at the leering men. They had been outnumbered almost 3-1, but Kyoshi's martial knowledge served them well. With so many people inside the Earthen Command post, the officers couldn't earthbend effectively, and Suki had to admit to immense satisfaction in beating them into the ground. At one point, Kana had been dragged down by several men, but her sisters all quickly converged to free her before the filthy hands could pry the armor off her. There were no fatalities once the Kyoshi warriors finally broke out of the post, but they left the officers inside with enough broken bones to keep them occupied. Just for safety, the painted warriors kept moving through the night to maximize their distance from the repulsive men. Guarding refugees came with no such problem, and was far more in line with Avatar Kyoshi's intentions for her warrior group. Admittedly, there was little to actually do escorting villagers and townsfolk from one place to another. The bandits they faced were often ill-trained and ill-equipped, making them barely worth considering as a threat. Things might change for the worse, though, with this group. Suki didn't know how the Fire Nation would react to so many civilians crossing their border, but she could only hope that the rumors of their disciplined conduct was at least half true. She hated to say it, but Suki really hoped that the damned Scorpion was a good example of how the Fire Nation military acted when dealing with civilians. After all the leering and dark looks, she much preferred dealing with overconfident psychopaths. The refugees came to their final checkpoint within the Earth Kingdom, a rather quiet dirt road hidden under the shadow of the Kola mountain range. Just beyond would be the conquered lands of the Fire Nation. The weathered and hunched guide leading them until now gave the weary civilians the all-clear to break camp. "I'll wait with you all until your Fire Nation contact arrives. He should be here by tomorrow noon at the latest." Suki frowned. "Why isn't he waiting for us? Isn't it more dangerous to wait out here?" The guide shrugged. "He's being careful. All it takes is one bad run-in with a patrol to mess things up." Suki conceded the point, though she wasn't entirely happy with it. If an Earth Kingdom force spotted them, she dreaded to think of what kind of chaos would ensue. Worse, a battle could suddenly take place in their region, forcing the refugees to flee. Thankfully, none of Suki's wild and bloody imaginations came true, and the contact appeared the following morning. The Kyoshi warrior didn't know what to expect in the first place, but she was still surprised by the new guide's appearance. The slightly aged man was garbed in the standard greens of the Earth Kingdom, and wore his attire neatly as any self-respecting merchant would. And just like many merchants Suki had seen, he had a cart to peddle his wares. A bit strange that it was comprised entirely of cabbages, though. The merchant guide adjusted his turban before exchanging bows with the first guide. "This is the group, then?" he asked courteously as he swept his gaze across the refugees. "Yeah, problems." The cabbage merchant stroked his short beard. There's little activity enough for trade to be moving, so it shouldn't be a problem. We just need to get the timing right. I'll leave them in your hands then." The guide up until now gave a grateful bow to the merchant before handing over a small jingling sack, probably his cut of the commission. The merchant beamed a smile at the staring refugees, and then clapped his hands. "All right, before we go, has everyone had breakfast yet? I still have some hearty cabbage soup if anyone's interested." And it was good soup indeed. Rather than just plain cabbages boiled to mush, these vegetables were salted, and the soup was mildly spiced with bones and other greens added to it. Suki and her Kyoshi warriors went for seconds and thirds, and the merchant Jei Choi surprisingly turned away their offer to pay. "The samples are free," he explained with a kindly smile. "I'm experimenting with new recipes, you see. I'm glad that you fine young warriors approve of this version." The Kyoshi warriors practically emptied out the cauldron between themselves as the refugee convoy began to move again. They kept at an almost leisurely pace, following after the merchant and his cart. For all Suki's nervousness, nothing happened along the way to the mountains. Morning turned into afternoon, and they finally had stopped for a break right as the dirt road led into a narrow tunnel. Suki took the opportunity to socialize with Jei Choi, who used the time to tend to his cabbages. "I'm surprised a trader like yourself would become a refugee smuggler," she casually remarked to open the conversation. The cabbage peddler smiled as he brushed away some dirt off a head of cabbage, and then turned that smile towards her once he was done. "It's something of a necessity at the time, and then it became a side job." "Necessity?" He gave a sad nod. "Aye, the war wasn't good for business, unfortunately." "Oh, I thought there'd be demand for food." Suki's basic understanding of commerce and the rumors she picked up in Kyoshi Island's docks told her that there were many people profiteering from the war, especially those who dealt with necessities like food. Jei Choi scowled. "Oh, there is. The problem is, I can't get my cabbages to the markets to be sold." "Bandits," Suki guessed. The cabbage merchant shook his head with some anger. "Worse. Earth Kingdom." At her surprise, he began to rant. "Either they charge an exorbitant toll to enter towns and cities to do business, or they seize my cabbages for the good of the Earth Kingdom. And that's if I'm lucky. The number of times I've had to replace my cart along with my cabbages after marauding soldiers descended like scavengers." He was visibly trembling with rage, enough that people around were starting to stare. Suki wanted to cut in, but he was on a roll. "And that's not all. Do you know how hard it is to source good cabbages now? There's so many villages I've passed through that have their whole harvests taken by Earth Kingdom armies. Whole fields looted, down to the last shoot. And it's hard enough to buy cabbages from the honest farmers. But after all that trouble, the officials and soldiers have to disrespect me and my innocent goods. Sometimes it feels like they're no better than bandits." Unsurprisingly, the refugees around Jei Choi were nodding their heads in agreement. After all, they were fleeing to escape forced conscription and similar seizing of food and wares. "I'm trying to ply an honest trade, but with the losses I've incurred, I was forced to try out a new career." Thankfully, he calmed, and it seemed that his rant was over. "And it turns out I'm rather decent at it," he finished with a smile. "I see," was all Suki could say, and then she had to risk another question. "So how do you get good at sneaking through the borders anyway?" "Oh, I'm just making use of the routes us traveling merchants use to seek more opportunity. With how hard it is to earn a living in the Earth Kingdom, routes like this one will be using have been made by entrepreneurs to make a better profit in the Fire Nation colonies." Suki couldn't help her skeptical look. "They don't confiscate your stuff?" Jei Choi shrugged. They used to be as bad as the Earth Kingdom. Most of them, at least. Then the Crown Princess took over, things changed. For supposed enemies, they're much friendlier when it comes to business matters. They don't put up any silly tolls. Their soldiers don't ruin your day." The merchant suddenly adopted a smug look. "In fact, even before this, some Fire Nation soldiers have been much better customers than the Earth Kingdoms." The skepticism remained. "Forgive me if I find that hard to believe." "I know," the merchant said with a boastful grin, aware that he had an audience around him. "But it's true. I was working along Omash's routes back when it was still under King Bumi. Some rather scrawny, but no less deadly bandits appeared and were ready to rob me of cabbage and yuans." The serious gravitas in which he told his tale drew Suki in, and she barely had the presence to note that the refugees, and even her fellow warriors, were drawn into it. "I would have lost everything there, probably even my life. But that all changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Or a group of their soldiers, anyway. They dealt with the bandits with ease. And for a moment I feared they would pick up where the bandits left off." Jei Choi's eyes had a faraway look to them as he continued. "But no, as it was getting late, they instead offered to host me at their camp and promised to escort me to safety. Oh, I was just as skeptical as you all at first, but it was hard to refuse men with pointy spears, right? So I followed them, and it turns out they were very polite hosts. Even gave me a bedroll and warm tea. They ended up buying my whole cartload of cabbages. No haggling, no threats, just asked about the price and then left a whole sack of money. Paid in Ba Sing Se yuans too, which had better exchange rates back then. I guess there's always exceptions to everything," Suki offered. "Yeep," Jei Choi agreed wistfully. I heard they're doing well for themselves now, so I'd like to think that they're responsible for influencing the princess. Now that was a curious string of words. Did they become the Fire Nation princess bodyguards or something? Oh no. From what I gather from the colonies and the trade ports, she promoted them to a royal group or something. No way. And made their new leader her champion. Ah, I still remember when he was a bright young lad back then. Suki exchanged dumbfounded looks with her sisters, and some of the colonists who seemed to have a clue. She had to ask, are you talking about Xing and the 11th? Jie Choi's eyes lit up happily. Oh, you know them too? Let me tell you, the tales people spin about them don't do them much justice. Merciful spirits, was this man raised or born wrong? The refugees continued their trek, with Jie Choi casually leading them into the mountains. Oh, there's plenty more entries like these all around the region, he helpfully told Suki. Sure, every now and then an Earth Kingdom patrol will find one and close it off, but us traders have our own earthbenders too. And how do you know a patrol won't show up here? The merchant smirked. I don't bribe them, if that's what you're expecting. I've had my fill of losing money to the Earth Kingdom. No, this little group I'm in have our ways to, read the weather. You can say, what kind of code speak is that? And why bother with it when he's practically giving away everything else right now? By evening, the convoy was led to a rather ominous-looking cave at the foot of the mountains, and the merchant had everyone set up camp for the day. It'll be a bit of a path, so get all the rest you can. As they usually did, the Kyoshi warriors kept a rotating watch throughout the night, though like the previous nights it was an uneventful task. The following day, lanterns were lit as they entered the cave, which quickly turned out to be a labyrinthian tunnel network. Suki scrutinized the merchant as he drove his cart and led the group through forks and junctions without hesitation. But try as she might, she could not figure out how he knew which route to take. There were no discernible carvings or discolorations on the walls and ground that she could see, no subtle objects placed about, and she even tried sensing the air pressure, but to no avail. The merchant noticed her annoyance and chuckled patronizingly. Don't try too hard. The system's been set up by some very thorough earthbenders. One of them used to be a customs inspector in Ba Sing Se, I think. As Jie Choi warned, traveling through the tunnels was a taxing ordeal. While the walls never closed in too tightly, the path sometimes seemed to spiral up and down or turn into sudden steep inclines. The only pauses they took were to refill the oil in the lanterns. Suki had no idea how long exactly they were walking, but she was sure that they had at least passed lunch. The number of refugees taking out rice balls and dried rations to munch on as they marched reinforced her guess. After spirits know how long, the Suki felt a faint current in the otherwise stale air. The merchant confirmed her guess with a reassuring smile to the refugees. Don't worry, everyone. We'll be out in time for dinner. With their morale boosted, the refugee convoy surged. The Kyoshi warriors too picked up the pace, eager to leave the claustrophobic environment. It felt like mere minutes until they saw sunlight slashing through the darkness, and then they were leaving the tunnels with Omash's silhouette just off in the distance. Welcome to the Fire Nation territories, Jie Choi said rather happily. Come, the main road's just down there. The ground there makes for a better place to camp. Won't that risk Fire Nation patrols? Someone asked, and Suki found herself wondering the same as well. The cabbage merchant shook his head. So long as none of you are in a soldier's uniform, they won't stop you. Even then, I heard the princess set up a system to welcome deserters. The Earth Kingdom might be stopping people from leaving, but the Fire Nation's not stopping people like us from coming in. That made disturbing sense. The Fire Nation could slowly sap the fighting strength of its enemy simply by draining away its people. In a sense, the Earth Kingdom was suffering attrition on two fronts. Whether or not the Fire Nation treated refugees any better, though. Don't worry, the Fire Nation road patrols are, well, not exactly friendly, but they'll just ask a few questions and then show you the road to the new towns they need settled. What kind of questions? A woman asked, hugging her child tightly. The merchant shrugged. Where are you from? What skills you might have? Supposedly they're on the lookout for specialists like carpenters, shipwrights, those kinds of things. The princess also made earth-bending a profitable profession. Builders and road layers are in high demand. All the talk of jobs got the refugees murmuring to themselves. What about the deserters? Suki asked, and once more Jie Choi shrugged. Same questions, apparently. I met a couple of them who got resettled as lumberers. they seemed okay enough to be paying customers. There were implications here that Suki knew she wasn't aware of just yet, but held significant consequences down the line. The Kyoshi warrior didn't like that she'd have this puzzle rattling about in her head for the foreseeable future. Slightly reassured, the convoy made their way down the mountain and followed the cabbage merchant to a cleared area by the side of the wide dirt road. A quick glance at the clearing made it clear to Suki that it was made specifically for people to camp. There were shallow holes of blackened earth which had clearly been used as fire pits. Mounds of dirt in a distance away from the site marked what Suki guessed were latrines. Was this another Fire Nation thing? Their princess must be really invested in the conquered lands. True to his claim, the refugees were setting up camp when a patrol of Fire Nation soldiers came down the road. Everyone froze in fear at their arrival, and the Kyoshi warriors kept a wary stance. The bored faces on the patrol turned into frowns, but they did not lower their spears. Instead, they walked up and one of them spoke as he surveyed the fidgeting refugees. "You bunch new?" Jei Choi walked up to give a slow nod. "Yes, sir. Refugees from the Earth Kingdom. And who are you?" "Just their guide, sir." The armored man nodded to Suki and her warriors with a grunt. "And them?" "Kyoshi warriors who've been employed as guards, sir." The patrol leader nodded. "HNH. Anyway, New Ozai is closed to migrants, so the nearest town is that way," he said as he pointed down the road. Something about his half-bored voice made it sound like he was going through a tedious chore. "Just follow the road and then take a right at the junction. Magistrates will settle you folks in. You're free to hunt for food, but I suggest you stay away from the elephant mandrills." He gave a pause for a moment. "What else?" "Oh, keep the roads clean, and if you come across any trouble, try and keep to the roads. Easier for patrols like us to find and help you. And yeah, don't cause trouble, and there won't be trouble, understood? On behalf of Crown Princess AZULA, welcome to the Fire Nation." And just like that, all the tension anticlimactically bled off the refugees and Kyoshi warriors, and the patrol resumed their route. Some of the men and women broke down into sobs of relief, while others slumped in silence. They resumed setting up camp, and then the Kyoshi warriors joined the overjoyed refugees for their first meal in enemy territory. "What will you do now?" someone asked, and Suki and her Kyoshi warriors exchanged silent glances before she answered. "We'll follow you until you reach town. Might as well see this to the end. After that, I suppose we might as well find out more about the Fire Nation lands." Keeping watch at night felt far less tense than it did back in the Earth Kingdom. The more she thought about it, the more unsettled Suki was by the realization that these refugees had to flee and watch their backs for the very people that were supposed to be protecting them, and that the supposedly perfidious and murderous Fire Nation were deemed as a better option enough to risk an exodus. And now that they were here, these people were more relaxed than she'd ever seen them during the trek in the Earth Kingdom. What was the Earth Kingdom fighting for, if its own people were so happy to run into the embrace of the enemy? It'd be one more annoying question for Suki to ponder over. A part of her wished that she and her sisters remained back on Kyoshi Island in blissful ignorance. That way she could easily hate the Scorpion and Prince Zuko, and tell herself that the Fire Nation were clearly the bad guys in everything. With Jei Choi and his cart trundling along, the refugee convoy began moving again the next morning, with a liveliness fueled by optimism. People were conversing loudly as they walked, and children were no longer hushed to silence. The Kyoshi warriors kept their positions at the edges of the convoy, but there was no denying that the atmosphere was far more relaxed now. "They should have been able to be like this back in the Earth Kingdom," Miu muttered. Suki nodded. "They shouldn't have had to leave their homes at all." They reached the junction the soldier had mentioned yesterday and took the turn. Another Fire Nation patrol passed by them without incident, only giving out the same instructions as before. On the following day, the refugee convoy finally encountered something that made them pause and rekindled their fears again. Even Jei Choi looked nervous as a procession of intimidating Fire Nation soldiers surrounding an ornate litter marched in from another road to overtake the refugees. What made everyone really nervous was when the procession stopped and the soldiers moved aside to create a clear path from the litter towards the refugees. Suki's hand slowly hovered to the war fan in her belt as she watched the heavy curtains of the litter pushed aside and a noble girl of sorts no older than her step out. At least Suki thought she was a noble, until Jei Choi hurriedly got down to his knees to prostrate himself. "Your Highness, The crown princess of the Fire Nation carried herself with a confidence born of competence and certainty. Keen dark gold eyes narrowed at Suki's general direction. The refugees practically quailed at her gaze, but the princess' focus was mostly directed at the Kyoshi warriors. Suki felt a chill run up her spine under the royals' judgmental look, but she kept her hand from her weapons. The Fire Nation soldiers were still at attention, and there were no overt signs of hostility. Finally, after staring enough, the princess began to walk towards the refugees, raising a lazy hand to keep her entourage in place. Only 2 other people followed her, both girls about the princess' age. One was clearly a noble, wearing a bored, disinterested expression and dressed in black and red. Her movement was laconic, but Suki's martial instincts noted the slight tenseness in the noble girl's movements. A capable fighter, then. The other was a performer of some kind, wearing the semi-revealing outfit all female acrobats did across the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. She moved with a carefree, feline grace, and despite the bright, light-hearted smile, something told Suki that she'd be in trouble if this girl decided to fight. "New migrants, I take it?" the princess inquired as she stopped in front of the cabbage merchant. "You can rise." Choi quickly got up and began bobbing his head. "Yes, Your Highness. Just a couple of days since we entered your domain." The princess hummed in thought. "You're their leader?" "Just their guide, Your Highness." She studied the man for a moment, and then eyed his cart. "Is that yours then?" Choi's head bobbed rapidly again, and the princess suddenly smirked. "Cabbage merchant, you don't happen to know Xing, do you?" This time Choi bowed deeply. "Yes, Your Highness. The colonel and his people have been my best customers." "Good. It's finally good to meet you. You see, Xing has told me of the cabbage merchant that saved the 11th from starvation." She made a show of snapping her fingers, and then a soldier marched out with a scroll. The princess took it and passed it over to Choi in a semblance of formality. "In recognition of your deeds, as royal patron of the 11th Royal Regiment, I, Crown Princess AZULA, hereby award you." "Choi, Your Highness." "Award you, Choi the cabbage merchant, with an open access trading license. Unless I give the word, you will be exempt from tariffs and tolls, and any Fire Nation colony that bars you from trading will answer to me." She gave a smug smirk as the refugees broke into muttering, and the merchant reverentially accepted the scroll. "I trust you would not abuse this privilege," she remarked with a sniff. "Why, Your Highness is most generous. I will of course not dare to selfishly exploit this gift." "Good." Suki tensed up again as the princess then turned her attention back to her. "Now, I've never expected to see the Kyoshi warriors outside of their island. We chose to aid these people in their travels," Suki answered simply, and then felt her hackles rise as the princess flashed a grin. "You'll find that there will be very little in my jurisdiction for any honest person fleeing the Earth Kingdom to worry about. Though, I suppose it's not the Fire Nation that they're worried about." Silence fell for a few seconds as Suki kept herself from responding to the taunt. The princess nodded ever so slightly with a satisfied smile before she raised her voice to address the men and women staring at her. "Anyway, we've settlements to populate and jobs that need working. So long as you pay your taxes that I've been told are about half of what you're used to. By the way, and abide by my laws, you can rest assured that you will find a comfortable life in the Fire Nation. And as proof of my hospitality, Captain," one of the soldiers stepped forwards with a salute. "Your Highness, we'll be guiding these people to Bahai, and then we'll carry on to Zilong. Form a protective perimeter." The soldiers fanned out to surround the properly intimidated and awed refugees. "Oh great, as if traveling with an armed guard wasn't annoying already," the noble girl in dark colors remarked. The acrobat giggled as she looked at the Kyoshi warriors. "Well, at least we'll have interesting company, Mai. There's nothing interesting about overdressed peacock pigeons. I hope they're not going to be as loud as their faces look." The Kyoshi warriors bristled, but the princess waved at her friend. "You can keep to the edges of the procession if you want, Mai. As for myself," she fixed a grin at Suki. "I have to admit, I'm quite curious about the Kyoshi warriors. Tell me, have any of you, by chance, met my colonel and my brother?" The rest of the journey was an ordeal as it was enlightening. Crown Princess AZULA turned out to almost be like the tales made her out. She was sharp and courteous, an ideal picture of not-so-humble nobility. AZULA knew what authority she carried and wore it with a sense of superiority, but she didn't throw it around to remind everyone that she carried it. More importantly, AZULA actually gave off the air of competence, compared to many of the generals and nobles Suki had encountered in the Earth Kingdom. Oh, she might see the common people as resources, but she also saw them as a source of boasting. It's hard to manage people correctly, you know. And how good must I be doing that the villages of my enemies are emptying out and risking their lives to come here? Suki reluctantly preferred that outlook than the callous disregard most highly ranked nobility carried. As uncomfortable as it was for the Kyoshi warriors, the princess kept up polite conversation with them, mostly inquiring about their training and practices, and never straying into politics. Suki and her fellows obliged the royal as much as they could tolerate, and credit to her. AZULA seemed to know just how long her presence was welcomed before returning to join her friends or mingle with the awed refugees. It was obvious that she exuded an undeniable charisma that Zuko lacked. It was the kind needed to keep a leash on the scorpion dragon, but judging from her tone whenever she talked about him, it seemed like they had less of a master-pet relationship and a more of an intimate bond. Yeah, Suki didn't want to know just how much of those rumors were true. Her nightmares of the boy's iron grip around her throat was more than enough. The Kyoshi warriors followed the mix of welcomed refugees and royal guard to the town of Bahai, and bid the former all the best in their new life as they met with the magistrates the princess personally summoned over. Jae-choi quickly disappeared to restock his cabbages, while the royal procession moved on. Feel free to explore the colonies, AZULA said far too smugly before leaving. See the changes I've brought so far, and compare it to whatever the Earth Kingdom has. I'd prefer it if you can spread the good word, but I'll settle for at least impressing the Kyoshi warriors and letting you judge for yourselves whether I'm as bad as the Earth Kingdom says I am. Suki found an opportunity to wipe the smugness of the princess and took it. They don't say anything about you. At least we've not heard anything pertaining to the Fire Nation's princess in our travels, she laconically replied, glancing at her warriors who quickly took the hint and nodded along. They only worry about attacks and raids, army movements, and the latest news from battles. There's talk about the opportunities the colonies might provide, but nothing about good or evil princesses ruling over the Fire Nation colonies. There was immense satisfaction at seeing the princess frown at that. I suppose I've been putting too much work into actually doing something to focus on projecting my image, she rationalized. And then Suki and her sisters were left to figure out their next move. They decided on taking the princess bait and exploring the conquered lands a little more since they were already here. Suki didn't know whether to hope that AZULA's claims about the colonies would be true or not. Zuko found that he really hated being stuck in a ship's cabin. But then again, he probably just hated being bedridden for a long time. His injuries were not severe, but were debilitating enough for the ship's physicians to force a regimen of bitter herbal soups that left him groggy. Uncle Iroh would come in every now and then with his soft, paternal smile to check on him. But other than that and the gaggle of annoying physicians, Zuko was left alone in the cabin and stuck with his thoughts. It forced his idle mind to wander, forced the prince to look back on his failures. So close. He had been so damned close to getting away with the Avatar, if not for the treacherous terrain. But then, even if he did get away with the Airbender, what then? How'd Zuko get back home with his quarry if he had run out into the wilderness? It was a short-sighted, idiotic plan now that he looked back on it. Fueled by desperation and enabled by luck, the whole affair had been a minor miracle now that Zuko thought about it. Somehow, he managed to find an entry into the Water Tribe's city, and it was one located close to the inner sanctum. And he came just in time to watch everyone but two girls leaving the place. Nobody noticed him dashing from the sewer pipe into the spirit oasis. And while he lost the initial duel with Katara, reinforcements did not come to her aid quickly enough to stop him from breaking out when the sun rose. And even after falling into a shallow crater, he'd be a frozen corpse out in the northern wasteland, if not for the Avatar's mercy. Lucky break after lucky break after lucky break. There was nothing close to resembling a plan. And when Zuko recalled those moments, there was nothing that could be dressed up as instinctual cunning or adept improvisation. Zuko had been lucky, that was all. And inevitably, the self-flagellating thoughts turned outwards. Zuko had been nothing but lucky, but even that wasn't enough to get him his prize. Compared to brilliant Xing, courageous Xing, who according to Uncle's retelling had been planning Zhao's execution for a while now, and had prepared for virtually all possibilities. Worse, the colonel carried out his mission under secrecy, so nobody can publicly acknowledge his exceptional deed. Xing had saved the world from Zhao's madness through well-thought-out plans and cunning, with even the consequences accounted for. Zuko couldn't even improvise his escape route after capturing the Avatar. Compared like that, the prince felt disgusted at himself for his abject failure. The prince clamped down on his simmering emotions, unwilling to risk the physicians or his uncle seeing him break down. He couldn't afford to lose the last shreds of respect anyone held for him. Anyone except for Xing, as undeserving as Zuko was. The colonel had sneaked in one day, poorly fit into a common firebender's uniform. Zuko recalled how his gut twisted, even while his heart felt comforted by the presence of the closest thing he had to a friend. "My prince, I'm glad the news of your death was proven false." Zuko didn't feel worthy at all when Xing bowed deeply and saluted. "Worry not. We've only a few more days left before returning to Zilong, and my healers will have you back up in no time." There was nothing the prince could really say, so he forced out an awkward "thank you." Xing kept him company for a short while more, and Zuko hated every moment of it. He hated how much the other boys still respected him, and treated him like the prince he was most certainly not. He hated that the colonel was the one who had to hide his presence, considering the great service he'd done for the Fire Nation. He hated knowing that he was once more indebted to Xing for saving him, since who knew what the Northern Water Tribe would do to an exiled royal prisoner. Most of all, Zuko hated himself for contributing nothing but awkward and rude one-word responses to Xing's attempts at conversation. The colonel was trying to buoy his spirits, but the prince couldn't accept the reassuring words, or the friendly smiles. "I'll leave you to your rest, your highness," Xing finished with a bow, giving no trace of annoyance or pity at all, only genuine, undeserved concern. Zuko was not only a dishonorable prince, he was a shit friend. By the time they reached Zilong, the exiled prince could walk on his own 2 feet again. Those shooting pains at various points of possibly fractured areas made it more of a shuffle. Under the cover of Colonel Wa's orders, Xing's disguised bodyguards helped Zuko off the ship and carried him to the waiting party of undisguised soldiers of the 11th. "You have waterbender healers," the colonel said in a stern, matronly tone. "See to it that His Highness receive the right care to his wounds." Zuko felt a bit self-conscious as he was put on a low-riding wagon and transported over to the familiar barracks of the Princess Fire Lancers. He squirmed as the armored men and women all gave deep, respectful bows and addressed him with warm politeness. The waterbender healers were far more casual, and they got straight to it. Zuko didn't know how long he was soaked in glowing, tingling water, but by the time they were done with him, the oldest healer had him stand up and walk around to make sure of their handiwork. While it felt good to be whole and unbroken again, the knowledge that he had yet another debt owed to Xing dampened Zuko's elation. It didn't get better when he left the prisoner's compound to find his uncle fidgeting uneasily. Xing was beside him, looking far less nervous, but wearing a slight frown on his face. The soldiers around the barracks went on with their daily schedule, overlooking the presence of royals save for respectful nods from those walking close by. "Ah, I see they did good work on you, Zuko," Uncle opened, and Zuko almost sighed. Trying to drag things out meant that it was probably bad news. The younger prince decided to cut straight to it. "What is it, Uncle? What happened?" Uncle Iroh glanced at Xing, who gave a neutral look, and then offered a consoling smile at Zuko. "Well, your sister will be arriving soon. She's very worried about you." As heartening as that was, it wasn't related to the bad news. "What is it, Uncle?" Zuko asked again. The older prince hummed and hawed until Xing finally had enough and stepped in. "Prince Zuko, news of your survival has reached the royal palace." Oh. Zuko suddenly felt a cold void bloom in his chest, and his whole body went stiff. "Your father, Fire Lord Ozai, is relieved to hear of your remarkable escape from death. Crown Princess AZULA has been ordered to prioritize the investigation of the botched assassination above all things. By the Fire Lord's orders, you are to remain in Zilong until her arrival, and any aid she might require of you is fulfilled." Zuko remained silent, bracing himself for the worst. Xing's shoulders rose and fell in a soft sigh. "Also, by the Fire Lord's orders, your hunt for the Avatar is to be aborted." "What?" Zuko's eyes went wide, and he felt his jaw drop. The colonel continued, ignoring his outburst. "Your sentence of exile is to be amended. You will remain away from the home islands for another 6 more years before your exile is lifted. Until then, it is suggested that you lay the foundations of your return here in the colonies." The resources of the colonial ministry, as well as the war ministry, will be made available to you, depending on what goals you wish to pursue. Zuko's legs felt weak as he stared at Xing, and then swept it towards his uncle. The former met his stare with an apologetic look, while the latter was filled with sympathy. The soldiers were veering away from the trio, giving them a wide berth. Walwadu. Why? Oh, Zuko, Uncle Iroh said as he stepped forward to reach for the younger prince. I'm so sorry. Why? Zuko repeated, staring down at his trembling hands. Why had father given up on him in such an insulting manner? Were his results so bad? He'd gotten so close to the Avatar, damn it. No, the prince whispered, and then shrugged off his uncle's comforting hand and stared at Xing. Let me see it. My prince. My father's order. The royal decree. I want to read it. It was uncle that answered. Please, Zuko. I've checked it myself. Your father's decree are as Xing says. Zuko stared at his uncle, and then realized the truth. Xing had sanitized his delivery of the order. His eyes began to sting and his body trembled, but Zuko still fixed his gaze on the colonel. I want to read it. Xing met the stare for a few silent seconds before sighing. Your Highness show dash. Let me read it, Xing. Another sigh, and then Xing proffered the gilded scroll. Zuko snatched it and began reading. As he read the words, the insinuations, he forced his hands to tighten its grip instead of letting go. As no results have been produced, Prince Zuko will be ordered to cease his futile quest. Exile commuted to 6 years. Missions appropriate for his average aptitude will be considered. Until he proves himself worthy of his royal title, all royal prerogatives will be withheld. It took all his strength for Zuko to remain standing as he forced himself to read through the scathing decree. And then he got to the next paragraph. Until then, the hunt for the Avatar will be open to any who deem themselves talented and experienced enough. The Avatar is now wanted by the Fire Lord, dead or alive. The reward for presenting. His vision blurred, and at last, Zuko's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, the scroll clattering out of his hands. The stunned prince barely felt his uncle's consoling embrace, and didn't hear at all his words of encouragement. He truly was a failure, then. Father had had enough of him, had given up on him. 3 years. His uselessness was tolerated for more than 3 years. Zuko wanted to let his tears flow freely, but his mind was still in shock as it digested the implications of the decree. Even after he returned, no matter what he did now, he'd be seen as the prince who couldn't end his exile by his own hands. The new terms of his return were made significantly easier, out of pity by his father. He'd not be able to regain any respect from the palace. He'd not be able to regain his honor. Despair turned into anger, and Zuko got up to his shaky feet, even with his uncle's weight on him. After gently but firmly pushing his uncle aside, the young prince wiped his wet eyes with the sleeve of his robe and began to walk. Xing stepped into his path, palms open in a placating gesture. My prince. Out of the way, Xing, he replied, almost snarling. I need to find the Avatar. Zuko dash, in a flash, Zuko turned towards his uncle. I almost got him, he roared in anguish. I almost captured the Avatar. With my own 2 hands. I had him. I know, Zuko, but please. The day is late. At least rest for the night. Your uncle is right, Prince Zuko, Xing said calmly. You cannot rush into this blindly. You need some rest and some time T-dash. I don't have any time left. I had 3 whole years of time. Wasted. Zuko exhaled aloud, and then let out a strangled sob as he pressed his face into the palms of his hands. I've been failing my father for 3 years. Please, Your Highness, do not hold yourself so lowly. You should not judge yourself solely by your father's esteem. Something in him snapped, and the young prince was snarling at Xing. Who are you to say, Xing? What do you know about disappointing your father, you orphan? Before the words fully left his lips, Zuko knew he made a mistake. Not just from the shock on Uncle Iroh's face, but the flash of genuine pain Xing revealed. The colonel quickly recovered back to stoic neutrality, but his eyes betrayed the hurt he felt at Zuko's words. More importantly, Zuko noticed a heavy, deadly silence descended on the training grounds. He glanced about with a sudden cold running up his spine, and found the stares of scores of soldiers fixed on him. Stares of utter shock which quickly turned into cold hostility. Zuko turned back to Xing, his mouth opening to apologize, but the colonel coughed and then raised a hand to forestall both his words as well as the soldiers around them. You are right, of course, Your Highness. It is not my place, as an orphan, to speak of such things. Xing, I'm Dash, Xing spoke over Zuko as if he didn't hear him at all. But please know that I gave my inappropriate suggestion with your interests in mind. He paused, and then looked like he wanted to continue, but ultimately the colonel just sighed. And then he looked past Zuko towards Uncle Iroh. I think it is best that you both find rest in Zilong's inns for the next few nights. I do not think the 11th can host you for the time being. Zuko felt the full weight of his uncle's disappointment for a second before the older prince nodded at Xing. I understand. I'm sorry for Dash, Xing shook his head. It is nothing, or will be nothing. The smile he gave was brittle and wavering. The prince is in an understandably poor mood. Then Zuko almost reeled back when the other boy directed his gaze at him. Shame flooded the prince as he saw the pain in those eyes. Please get some rest and heed your uncle's advice, Prince Zuko. After a stiff bow, Xing walked off in a hurry, leaving Zuko to suffer the disapproving frown of his uncle. Uncle, I dash later, Zuko, the older prince said curtly with a firm hand raised. Come, we'll need to find a room before it gets dark. Zuko remembered the murderous stares he was getting from the compound, and then hastily left with his uncle. He kicked himself in his head throughout the trek into town. He'd been reckless again, and this time it might very well cost him the respect and friendship of the last person to consider him as such. Uncle Iroh also remained silent throughout, shaking his head and sking every now and then, even as he secured them a room for the night. Finally, in the privacy of their rented room, the older prince began to scold Zuko. That was a very, very foolish thing you did, Zuko. I know, uncle. Zuko hung his head as he sat on the bed. He could offer no excuse. Look at me. You've insulted not just a friend, but someone who has been supporting you all this time. Xing has offered his aid freely and asked for nothing in return. You've dishonored yourself, Zuko. I know, uncle, he repeated wearily. I messed up badly. That Xing hadn't called him out for a duel. At least not yet. Who knows what tomorrow would bring? Was a small mercy Zuko was very much aware of. Then the memory of countless cold, hateful eyes boring into him made him shudder. And the prince then realized that a small mercy might not be enough. Would it be safe here tonight? Or maybe he'd have better chances leaving Zilong. You'll apologize to him first thing tomorrow, Uncle continued. Formally and publicly. The 11th will forgive you eventually, I'm sure. The 11th. Not Xing. Even Uncle Iroh knew the true danger here. First thing tomorrow, Zuko agreed with a heavy nod. Sharp knocks interrupted the conversation, and the older prince went to the door. Zuko's blood ran cold when he heard a familiar voice. Too late did Zuko realize that his estimation was wrong. The 11th wasn't the true danger. Good evening, Uncle. Azula's cold voice was filled with royal contempt and a sibling's disgust. Now move aside and let me talk to my ungrateful, tantrum-throwing brother. Landing on Zilong was a pleasant enough experience for the princess and her small entourage. Chief Colonial Overseer Day and a squad of the garrison greeted her amidst the setting sunlight with all the formality and respect her station warranted. And Azula allowed herself a smug smile as she watched Tai Li and Mai boggle at the reception they were getting. Welcome back to Zilong, Your Highness. Your brother, Prince Zuko, has arrived in the afternoon and has gone up ahead to the 11th's barracks. Thank you, Overseer. Azula was about to turn to her friends when a commotion caught her eyes. Hey, isn't that your brother, Azula? Tai Li pointed out, and the princess frowned. Further down the main road, Zuko was following Uncle Iroh, and both carried themselves with varying tenseness. Her brother's shoulders and head were slumped into defeat, while Uncle was uncharacteristically stiff with irritation for perhaps the first time Azula had ever seen him. She watched as both men disappeared into a nearby inn, raising further questions. Surely the barracks would have space reserved for Dum-Dum and Uncle? Something was amiss here. Her friends took the hint as well, and turned to Azula with silent questions in their eyes. The princess shook her head. We'll have to find out what has happened. Azula was about to get Tai Li, and might have followed her into the inn, when she noticed another curious sight. The captains of the 11th were leading a small group of soldiers, marching with the intent to, if not kill, then cause grievous harm. Even Ren and Sungo were part of it. The townsfolk wisely got out of their path, though the mob actually split and flowed harmlessly around an elderly couple caught in the middle of the road. The wheels in Azula's head began to turn. Surely these events are not related? How in the world can they be? Come girls, I need answers. Her bodyguards followed after, along with Overseer Day and his own armed entourage. The soldiers noticed AZULA, and immediately they stomped towards her. They came to a stop as she drew close, and bowed as one. "What is the meaning of this?" AZULA demanded sternly, sweeping her gaze across the soldiers who were unusually tense. Mosey answered, his usually stony gaze now simmering with anger. "I apologize, Your Highness. But Prince Zuko has done a great offense to our colonel." "What do you mean?" Day asked. The lieutenant colonel exchanged glances with the captains, and then he sighed. While Colonel Xing and Prince Iroh were trying to calm him down during a bout of emotion, Prince Zuko turned on him. Mosey gulped, his gaze flickering over to Day before returning to AZULA. He called Xing an orphan princess, said that he couldn't know the disappointment of a father. AZULA stared blankly at Mosey as she processed the words. "I'll get my sword." She snapped out of the daze to raise an arm and stop an angered Day. "Hold, Overseer." AZULA turned back to the mob of soldiers. "Tell me exactly what happened." And they did, with all the meticulous detail of a scout's report. AZULA felt her blood run hot, and her heart go cold as she turned towards the inn her brother had entered. "Ty Lee, wait for me at the governor's mansion. Overseer Day, guide them." She fixed them with a piercing gaze. "You will not take any further action. You will tell no one what you saw and heard. Understood? This is a family issue." Her two friends and the overseer nodded and left, leaving AZULA with the offended men and women of her 11th Regiment. Together, they headed towards the inn, where only the captains followed the princess in. "Innkeeper." AZULA picked out the establishment's owner easily enough and tossed him a pouch of coins. "In case you have to rebuild, I suggest you evacuate the building, save for my brother and uncle." The innkeeper and his staff broke into a scramble, while the patrons present hurried out the building as quietly as they could. "Officers, with me." AZULA climbed the stairs and measured, forcefully even steps. Her mind was a clamor of emotions as she fought to rein in the urge to immolate the place, and pick the ruins apart to find her brother and cremate him on the spot. She could see herself ordering her insolent brother to be dragged back to the barracks and made into a training aide. The princess had to draw in a slow breath to center herself. She was not her spiteful father. She was not her reckless brother. AZULA forced herself into an eerie calm as she headed to the door the owner had so helpfully pointed out to her. She lifted a hand to knock, but paused to turn to Mosey and the captains. "Nobody leaves or enters this room without my say-so." Silent nods answered her, and the princess knocked on the door. As disappointed as Iroh was at his nephew's conduct, the appearance of his niece filled the old prince with grave concern. "AZULA," he began, but the girl placed a hand on his shoulder and pushed him aside with surprising strength. "I'll say this once, uncle. Do not interfere. Actually, never mind." "Mosey Kai." Strong arms of once friendly faces reached in to hold Iroh back as the other captains of the 11th Regiment entered the room to block off all exits. Zuko sat straight on the bed, utterly petrified as he stared at his sister slowly walking over to him. AZULA dash, AZULA snapped forward and swung a palm wreathed in blue flames, slapping Zuko so hard that he was knocked to the ground. Iroh felt real fear for his nephew when he heard the cold contempt in AZULA's voice. "You've said enough for today, brother. Now shut up and listen." The girl bent down to grab her brother by his collar to lift him up to his knees and glare down at him. "You know, I was supposed to begin our reunion by apologizing." Her eyes flickered to Iroh for a moment, including him in the conversation. "I already bowed to Ty Lee and Mai. You remember my old classmates, right? I offered them my deepest, genuine contrition at my honestly disgraceful behavior last time, and I was supposed to offer the same to you. I'd have gotten down on my hands and knees to seek your forgiveness for all I've done to you." Wisps of smoke began to snake up from the collar of Zuko's robes before AZULA let go and stepped back. "It seems I'll have to postpone that apology for another time," she growled. "At least this time, you'll deserve the wrongs I'll inflict on you." "Please AZ-dash." The princess wasted no time in delivering a backhand to silence her brother, and Iroh winced as he saw the specks of blood staining her knuckles and dribbling down Zuko's lips. "I'm not done, brother." AZULA turned and paced away from Zuko, glancing at Iroh for a brief moment. "When you were exiled, when you were stupid enough to fall for our father's trap, did you know the amount of planning my Xing and I exchanged in our letters?" She looked over her shoulder at her bruised brother. "Do you know how much he prepared to ensure your safety? How much he asked of me?" AZULA turned, focusing her full contempt at the young prince. Do you know the amount of resources I've invested in the courts and the colonies to keep your stupid little hunt afloat? The favors I leveraged, so you always had a friendly dock ready to receive you? Or convinced governors to reserve a portion of their supplies for your use? Or shipwrights paid to remain in the colony, so your ship would get repaired with all haste? Iroh was surprised at the revelation. He always thought their smooth resupplies and priority reception were due to their status as princes. Zuko opened his mouth, but then slumped with resignation. Shing asked me to aid you, and so I did. He believes you had an important part to play, AZULA said with a derisive snort. Still does, I bet. She shook her head as a brittle smirk formed on her face. He doesn't think I see it, but Shing has been laying plans for you far more extensively than he has for me. If I didn't know him as I do now, I'd have thought he's infatuated with you. At both princes' confused looks, AZULA chuckled. Up until just now, you were included in our plans for the future. You'd have played a vital role, in fact. She strode towards Zuko, smirking as he flinched back and kneeling before him. I want you to know this. You could have been made Fire Lord, brother, if the conditions were right, and we were doing a rather good job at getting there. I'd have stepped aside and let you reclaim your place as heir to the Fire Nation. At worst, if we couldn't engineer it, if it couldn't be helped, I'd have given you the colonies as your domain and left you to rule it as a second Fire Nation in all but name. The princess sighed and then rose back up, Zuko's stunned wide eyes following her movements. Of course, all of that has gone out the window. Your pathetic tantrum has proven to me that you're not fit in any way to lead, let alone rule. You'd think that years hunting the Avatar would build some character. But you're no better than the bootlickers in the palace. AZULA shook her head again. Besides, you wouldn't appreciate what we've done anyway. All you care about is for Daddy's non-existent attention. At those words, Zuko shot up. Reclaiming my honor is all I have left. Iroh felt some relief that his niece didn't retaliate this time, but instead sighed heavily. Stupid, blinkered idiot. She leveled him a look that made the prince take a wary step back. All you have left. All you have left. AZULA's hand went up to point at Iroh. Who's that then? Is Uncle worth nothing compared to your so-called honor? The finger swept across the room. Is the open welcome of the 11th nothing to you? You'd throw anything and everything real you have, just for something that doesn't exist. You take that back. Make me, you whiny brat. To Iroh's horror, Zuko tried to do just that and lashed out with a punch. It was an overcommit strike, one fueled by reckless rage, and AZULA was aware of that. She sidestepped the attack and slapped Zuko in the back of his head as he passed her, knocking him off balance and causing him to tumble to the floor. I might have been a bully back then, but you're still pathetic. Iroh tried to step in, unwilling to bear the escalating danger in the air. Please, AZULA. Your brother is still coming to terms with your father's recent decree. Surprisingly, she looked at him with a sad, fragile smile. Oh, I know, Uncle. But that's on him. She lightly kicked at Zuko as he tried to rise. After all, I didn't take it out on Shing when he forced me to realize that I was nothing but a tool. She walked towards Iroh, her eyes flickering with chained rage even as tears started to well at their edges. I didn't insult him because I finally knew that not only did my own mother fear me too much to love me, but my father never truly cared about me at all. All the Fire Lord cares is that I perform better than my brother, that I make my brother look bad. The pained, protective looks from the captains around him told the older prince that this was something of a sore topic for them. Iroh felt a pang of guilt that tainted the sympathy he suddenly felt for his niece. He'd been so focused on his nephew, he realized, that he overlooked her own hardships. He missed the subtler signs of hurt in AZULA in favor of the more obvious ones on Zuko. Oh, AZULA! The girl raised a hand to stop Iroh from continuing, and he watched her ruthlessly crush her welling emotion. I've dealt with it. My Shing and the 11th helped me deal with it, are still helping me deal with it. She turned back to her brother, who had gotten up into a pained crouch, just as Shing was trying to help you. Except I wasn't immature enough to insult Shing for being a reliable friend. Zuko once more made to reply, but his sister talked over him. Even with her back turned to him, Iroh could feel the cold spite radiating from AZULA. Father might have loved you, loved us, once, but that was a long time ago, Zuko. Now, the only way you can ever earn his approval is by dying in a futile attempt to reach for the non-existent pardon he's been dangling in front of you. If you don't believe me, ask Uncle when you finally have the mental capacity to. Maybe he'll stop coddling you at last and teach you how to actually move on. The girl sniffed as her brother directed his horrified expression at Iroh, who could only grimace in reply. She regained Zuko's attention by standing right up in front of him. But that's for another time. Right now, I'm going to give you two choices, brother. AZULA leaned in, causing the young prince to almost stumble as he leaned back in return. You'll be at my regiment's barracks tomorrow morning. You'll get on your hands and knees and beg Xing for my regiment's forgiveness. You'll beg, not like a prince, but like the unworthy, pathetic waste that you are right now. And you'll keep begging until the captains here have given Xing their approval. Iroh felt all AZULA's anger and spite condense into something far greater, far deadlier as she took a step back from Zuko. Or, you do not show up at the barracks. Then I'll give you a month's head start. And after that, I'm going to turn you into a training target for the scout recruits of the 11th. I'll even make sure they bring you back alive, so that I can drag you to the palace to see father smiling at last as I humiliate you. AZULA shrugged with mock casualness. If you're lucky, he'll execute you right after that for breaking your exile and being in his presence. The false levity lasted for barely a second before it was quickly replaced by her cold, restrained rage. Regardless, after this, regardless of what you choose, I'll rescind every order and drop every favor I have in the colonies that protects and supports you. There'll be no reserve supplies, no donations, no mysterious helpful messages or accidental gossip to overhear. The governors will no longer turn a blind eye to your presence, and the generals and admirals will be barred from loaning you any men or assets. AZULA paused for a second to let her words sink in before she continued. My 11th Royal Regiment will no longer have their gates freely open to you. Any unauthorized entry into their camps or grounds will be considered trespassing and punished as such. You'll only have access to their healers on my approval. You'll have to pay with interest for any supplies you plunder from their stores. By your own careless words, you've lost the friendship and respect of the 11th. She paused again, watching Zuko slump in despair. Iroh was about to interject, to plead on his nephew's behalf, but then AZULA spoke again. However, I'm not as stupid as you to simply waste all the investments made on your sorry ass. AZULA drew in a breath, probably to calm herself judging from her pose. If you manage to earn their forgiveness, you'll be given a chance to earn your both back by deeds. I'll leave that to Mosey and the captains to figure out. Xing will be kept from interfering, or he'll end up coddling you. Iroh saw his niece give a cold, sharp smirk. Until then, though, AZULA suddenly lashed out, sending a fist straight into Zuko's guts and almost folding him over. That's for disrespecting my Xing, for hurting him when all he's ever done was look out for you. Next time, I'll let the whole regiment do it. With their daggers. The princess stood straight again and brushed the bangs of her hair back. I hope to see you tomorrow morning, Zuko. Huh, and I didn't set anything alight. Go me. She then turned to give a polite nod at Iroh before heading for the door. Good evening, uncle. For my brother's sake, I hope you're able to talk some sense into him for once. She was about to step through the doorway when she froze and looked over her shoulder. For what it's worth, I will apologize for all I've done eventually. Whether it'll be when we're both older and wiser, or if it's over your gravestone, that'll be for you to decide. The hand on Iroh finally let go, and the captains of the 11th followed their princess out, leaving the princes alone in their room. Zuko slowly crumpled to the ground, tears staining his cheeks as his arms wrapped around his stomach that AZULA had just buried her fist into. After all he'd seen and heard, Iroh didn't know where to start to pick up the pieces. As the dawn sky slowly lit up, AZULA led her friends to the barracks of her regiment. Ty Lee and Mai were still rubbing their eyes and yawning, but they'd been the ones who were curious about what was happening. My brother made a mistake, so he's going to own up to it, was all the princess gave them. She'd have preferred spending the night with Xing, to give what comfort she could to him. But Ren had said that he'd locked himself in his room, and AZULA had her friends waiting for her. Not to mention an agitated overseer Day to calm down. The latter was at least easy enough to deal with. Day's unabashed favoritism for Xing was quickly sated when she told him the matter was dealt with. The way Day kept rambling about taking his sword to Zuko, though exposed a new weakness about the man to AZULA. Reliable and effective as he was, she'd have to be careful about giving him news about the 11th and Xing from now on. AZULA could only imagine how much more fanatical the overseer would be if Xing had managed to pry his arm loose to avoid being amputated. Ooh, nice place. Ty Lee commented as they reached the gates of the 11th's barracks. The aura's a bit yucky though. Azula fought the urge to roll her eyes at that, reminding herself that with Xing's spirit talking, maybe her friend's thing with auras had some merit. Besides, with the air of anticipation lingering around the armored but unhelmeted men and women all neatly lined up in parade formation, Azula could see where Ty Lee was coming from. The whole regiment stood at attention, but as they noticed their royal patron, Xing gave an order and they dropped to their knees in unison. "Impressive toy soldiers you've collected, Azula," Mai said, her bland tone heavily masking her teasing. Ty Lee nodded, her gaze sweeping across the formation with excitement. "Yeah, they look far cooler than the soldiers I've met. Ooh, and the auras all turned a nice red too." She paused, and then gave Azula a grin as she pointed at Xing. "He's kinda hot." The acrobat whispered loudly, one hand cupping her mouth. "But a little young, don't you think?" This time Azula did roll her eyes, giving a glance to her regiment first. "You may rise." Only after they did so did she lead her friends over to Xing, chaining her nervousness at the coming introduction. She saw through his mask of professionalism, how his hand twisted slightly, how his back threatened to slouch every few seconds. He hadn't gotten over Zuko's stupidity. Hopefully, her little intervention would perk him up. Azula preferred her Xing more sure and confident. "Girls, this is Colonel Xing, of my 11th Regiment. Xing, this is Mai and Ty Lee, old classmates." Xing's eyes shifted to Mai, and then Ty Lee, and Azula felt a weird relief that his eyes remained fixed on their faces, before he gave a sharp salute. "Lady Mai, Lady Ty Lee, the 11th Royal Regiment welcomes you, and is grateful for your presence." "So you're the Scorpion?" Mai asked, sizing him up. Far too polite for a bloodthirsty monster. Azula felt only a little annoyed, reminding herself that Xing's reputation was allowed to be exaggerated on purpose, so her friend's impression was to be expected. She did, however, feel a bit more annoyed at how Ty Lee studied him. "Oh, you're way better looking than they say." Before the princess could cut in, the other girl directed a smirk at her. "I can see why Azula's got you collared." Even as a blush crept up her cheeks and a new host of images flashed through her mind, Azula's eyebrow went up. "Collared?" Mai was the one to answer with a sigh and a roll of her eyes. "Some people say that you've got the Scorpion on a tight leash, releasing him on your enemies like an attacked dog." "Attack Scorpion." The dour girl gave an uncharacteristic grin. "I don't think you want to know how they say you keep him collared." Ty Lee giggled, and Azula could hear some of the soldiers, Run and Ping especially, snorting or coughing. Azula was more distracted by the images of herself trying to actually collar Xing to be annoyed by their reactions. After all, what were the chances of Xing actually allowing her to get it around his neck? In all likelihood, he'd be the one to overpower her and force the humiliation around her neck. And then he'd probably further humiliate her by, "Azula?" She snapped out of that pleasant little imagination with a cough, and then waved a stupidly grinning Ty Lee off. "It's nothing. I'm fine. If I may ask, Your Highness," Xing interrupted in a formal tone, "to what does your regiment owe the pleasure of such an early visit?" "Oh, he didn't know." Azula's gaze flickered to Mosey standing beside her colonel, whose slight wince confirmed it. "Well, time to give Xing the good news personally then. I've been informed of my brother's impropriety," Azula said, noting with some concern how Xing froze up. "I've had a talk with him last night to educate him about his error. He should be here soon." "Princess?" There was something other than mild confusion in his tone. "Concern." Ty Lee broke her worrying train of thought. "Speaking of, that's your brother Azula?" The princess turned towards the road, where sure enough, a disheveled Zuko dragged himself closer, while Uncle Iroh followed right behind with an expression of heavy concern. Azula wouldn't be surprised if her brother had refused his help in getting here. Xing saw the princes too, and he immediately hurried towards them. Azula noted how looks were exchanged between the officers of the 11th, as well as the worry that flickered on Mai's face. The three girls followed after the colonel, and as he and Zuko drew closer, the latter stopped to drop to his knees. "Colonel Xing," Zuko rasped rather clearly considering the dark bruise on his cheek, "I deeply apologize for what I said yesterday." He was about to bend over and plant his forehead onto the dirt road, but Xing intercepted him. "Prince Zuko, please rise." Zuko shook his head in response. Please find it in yourself to forgive me for what I did." There was a moment of silence as Xing stared at the marks left on Zuko's face. He glanced up at Iroh, who who gave a pained look but otherwise did not reply, and then turned towards AZULA, who found herself surprised by the anger building in her colonel's eyes. "Princess, AZULA, you did this to your brother?" As she opened her mouth to form a reply, someone else spoke out. "I did it," came the voice of Ping, who took a step forward to meet Xing's stare. AZULA turned to stare at the woman, who now wore a stoic mask. "I did it," Rin said, and did the same as her colleague. "I did it." Kai followed after, and then Mosey and the other captains followed suit. AZULA's mind raced. The officers had stepped in. They'd noticed Xing's reaction and immediately acted. Or had they known all along that this would be how he reacted? But they still came for Zuko. AZULA gulped, and then steeled her resolve. Only a weak ruler deflects blame onto others. She waved the soldiers back, and then stepped forwards to meet Xing's glare. "I did it," she said evenly, not backing down from the turbulent emotion in her colonel's gaze. "I had to make sure that my brother understood the enormity of his mistake. I made it clear that he had misdirected his anger." Xing did not reply at first, but then his head returned towards Uncle Iroh. "You let her dash," AZULA didn't let him finish. "I had Kai and Mosey hold my uncle back to stop him from interfering." Xing got up, and as their eyes met once more, the princess' assumption that he understood her actions was correct. Unfortunately, her assumption that he'd agree to it in any way was far off the mark. "Did you have to be so harsh on your own brother?" A hint of defensiveness spiked in AZULA. "I had to hammer the message home, or my boneheaded brother wouldn't get it. He turned on you, Xing, and that was a mistake. But so is beating him up like this," he immediately replied. And the princess then realized that she had grossly miscalculated the results of her actions. She'd thought that Xing would at worst need firm convincing to properly receive Zuko's apology. Instead, he had slipped into the beginnings of a combat stance. Zuko shook his head and joined the conversation. My sister is right, Xing," he surprisingly groaned out. I was wrong to insult you. You didn't deserve dash." "No, she's not, Zuko," the colonel snapped. "We'll talk after you're healed up." AZULA frowned. "I can't allow you to do that, Xing." "Why not?" She drew in a breath. "Because I made it official that my father's decree also applied to this regiment. Zuko will get no special treatment from the 11th. "But he's your brother," Xing reasoned, and AZULA felt her tolerance for his tolerance towards Zuko reach its breaking point. "And?" she asked, taking a step forward. "It shouldn't stop him from suffering from the consequences of his mistakes. You were insulted, and by extension so was the 11th. My regiment. Such things cannot be left unpunished." All he did was dash. AZULA waved a hand to cut him off. All he did, as an officially dishonored prince, was lose his common restraint and gravely insult a commander of the Fire Nation. An act of disrespect that calls for Agni Kai by you or any of your subordinates. That got Xing to shut up and think at least. Zuko made a mistake. Your officers were rightfully going to rectify that mistake. I found a more productive compromise. Did it have to warrant taking everything from him? Not everything, but yes. AZULA leveled a frown at her. Xing, consequences must be paid for, Xing. Even for my brother who you so greatly treasure. I thought you of all people would understand the importance of reputation and morale. Xing finally broke his stare from AZULA to glance at the officers behind her, who were not backing down either. Finally, the colonel gave a heavy sigh and shook his head. "This wasn't the way to do this," he muttered. "You should have let me handle this," he said, both to AZULA and his officers. "And then what?" the princess hissed back. "You'd let him off with a slap on the wrist. You'd let resentment grow in the regiment for that." AZULA couldn't hold back her sneer. "What have the spirits planned for Zuko, Xing? Why do you care so much about my brother that you treat him with such a soft touch?" At that, the anger in Xing's eyes flared, but the air around them turned cold despite the rising sun. AZULA defiantly met the boy's gaze, noticing how his jaws were grinding ever so slightly. Beside him, Zuko seemed torn, but it was Uncle Iroh who finally stepped in between them and broke the tension. "Everyone, please calm down. The day is beginning. It will not be good for passing townsfolk to see this bickering." AZULA forced herself to relax and gave a shallow nod. "You're right, Uncle. I'm sorry for losing my temper." She gave Xing a look, and he too unwound and nodded to a ceasefire. The air warmed up to normal temperatures right after that. "We'll talk in the office. Zuko gets to see the healers." AZULA didn't bother arguing over that point, and instead waved a hand. "Oh, all right, but you'll receive his apology after that." as you rightly deserve to. So long as he's not being dragged through the mud and degraded, Xing replied, and then marched past AZULA, throwing a look at the captains as he walked past them. Would have been better if we did go the extra mile and just kill Dash. Shut up, idiot, Rin hissed as she smacked Rufin into silence. AZULA returned to Tai Li and Mai, noting their discomfort and concern. As ever, Tai Li was more obvious with it, while Mai tried to hide it under a mask of boredom. Lover's tiff. Office disagreement, AZULA curtly corrected Mai. You alright, Tai Li? Hope all the posturing didn't scare you too much. The usually smiling girl shook her head. It's nothing. Just that Xing of yours. He was in an ugly purple just now. Oh, and that means he's troubled and angry. AZULA was about to make a snide remark, but her friend continued. Like he's struggling against something he wants to keep hidden. Now that was curious and quite worrying. Come on, AZULA simply said. There's breakfast in the mess hall. They followed the officers back into the barracks, with Zuko and Uncle Iroh an awkward distance apart. The soldiers dispersed from their formation to return to their usual routine. AZULA left her friends in the care of the officers, and saw off her uncle and brother into the prisoner's compound, and then headed into Xing's office. Koshi and the other bodyguards stood guard outside, and would become an impenetrable barrier against eavesdroppers and unwanted guests. Xing was slumped in his seat, and didn't waste time in speaking as soon as the door was closed. Please, AZULA, Zuko needs your support. And are you going to tell me why exactly? Because, he paused, and then let out a loud sigh before fixing a weary gaze on her. Because he'll be the one to win over the Avatar. AZULA froze at that, staring mutely at Xing, who sighed again. He's supposed to go over to the Avatar's side. I was hoping to have him soften the Avatar's stance against us. Against you, when the time comes. The princess found her words too jumbled up to form a decent reply. And how? Xing gave a short huff. He was supposed to be trapped with the Avatar somehow and switch sides. But after your father's decree, I don't know how to proceed. AZULA broke herself out of her daze and frowned. And my intervention doesn't help things, she asked honestly. It took a few seconds before Xing slowly straightened in his seat. I honestly don't know anymore. But you still shouldn't have harmed him like that. The princess snorted. I told you, you should have left it to me, AZULA, Xing said in a half-pleading tone. My officers should have left it to me. I can't have anyone do my dirty work for me. Not without me knowing it, like this. AZULA folded her arms and raised an eyebrow at him. As if you don't do the same for others. How many men have you ordered silenced before you informed their victims? Her colonel rose up from his seat with another sigh. So I'm a hypocrite. I'm glad you noticed. AZULA let the silence bloom, losing herself in her thoughts for a moment before sighing. I might have overdone it with Zuko, but your officers were still right to demand satisfaction from him. In court, their devotion to avenge the slight on you would be worth commending. They'd end up brutalizing him. That's why I stepped in, she instantly replied. You were barely any better. AZULA forced herself to shrug the words off. As I said, I'll admit that I might have overdone it. Can you at least return some indirect support for your brother? No. Besides, now that he knows about it with how hard-headed Zuko is, he'd probably reject any help from you and me from now on. She allowed herself a dry smirk. I'm sure he still has a way to go before he finally gives up on his delusions of honor and chasing father's approval. Xing walked over to her, with only resignation in his eyes. So now what? We wait for Zuko's apology, AZULA replied without missing a beat. I forgot to mention it earlier, but I did give him a chance to earn the regiment's good graces back. It didn't take much for the wheels in her head to produce an idea. You could just figure out a way to fit him into whatever plans the spirits still have for him. They haven't failed you yet, I heard, so you can trust them to guide him to where he's needed. It doesn't work like that, Xing groaned. Then come up with a different plan, for both Zuko's deluded need for honor and winning the Avatar over, AZULA breezily said. In any case, we probably still have some time. I hope you can hold whatever you have against me only against me, and at least have a cordial meeting with my friends. Thankfully, Xing just nodded and followed her to the door. I'll still have to arrange something for Mosey and the captains, he muttered. Nothing public, AZULA relented. I'll step in if you go too far with whatever you come up with. We were talking about hypocrites. Everyone's a hypocrite, she instantly answered back. While the food wasn't too bad, the weird atmosphere made the mess hall an interesting sight for people watching. Tai Li noted the pangs of uneasiness from the soldiers as they went about their lives. The higher officers in particular wore concern and creeping guilt like veils over themselves, even as they quite expertly put on courteous masks in front of Tai Li and Mai. "We came at a bad time," Mai bluntly asked, hiding her amusement under her usual disinterested voice. A Captain Ren replied with a brittle smile, green and yellow with awkwardness. "It's not the best, but it's not your fault either." Tai Li found the captain's reassurance rather refreshing. They were clearly well in AZULA's graces to be able to admit failure, rather than trying to dress it up. "It's a rather unfortunate series of events." The girls nodded at that, but Mai wasn't content to leave it at that. She was still tinted in the bubbling orange of anger. "So you were all going to hurt Zuko? Or kill him?" "Of course not." Next to her, Captain Ping not so subtly cleared her throat to give herself time to reply. "We were going to demand that he, answer for his insult. He's still AZULA's brother, after all." "So, you're all going to get in trouble?" Mai prodded. Tai Li saw how worry snaked into the captains as they exchanged glances. The realization that they might have been too impulsive. "I'm not sure," Ping lied lamely. "Maybe they weren't the cold-blooded, insidious murderers that some stories made them out to be. Colonel Xing must be lucky to have such loyal soldiers under his command and looking out for him," Tai Li offered, watching as the women relaxed a little as they received her words. She gave a light elbow into Mai, when the other girl seemed ready to add in an unhelpful quip. "I've only heard rumors about him, but I didn't know he was that young." "Yeah, he's been with us for a long while," Ren said with a sad yet proud smile. "Practically grew up in the regiment." "Sounds rough," Mai commented, thankfully getting the hint and not poking them any further. Both captains winced before they nodded. "Our old colonel wanted to keep him away from the fighting, but we got ambushed, and Xing saved some lives by joining the fighting." Rin sighed. "After that and a few more incidents, the colonel had to officially conscript him, so he'd be forced to behave like a soldier. Otherwise," it was Ping who answered with a chuckle, "otherwise he'd keep disappearing the moment we come across an enemy camp, to try and sneak in. Thank the spirits Sungo kept him out of the worst of it," Rin muttered. "Oh, he's our scout captain." She pointed over to a grim-looking man nodding away as another soldier spoke. "Kept Xing out of the worst trouble back then, and was one of Xing's more regular babysitters." Tai Li quirked her head to one side at the explanation, prompting the captain to continue. "Xing likes to run off, so Sungo keeps him company for his own safety. Plus, as a scout, he's not as stuck keeping soldiers in line like us." She paused for a brief second before snorting. "Shouldn't be surprising that they got along and Sungo started picking up Xing's ideas." "That's sweet," Tai Li commented, enjoying the warm pinks and reds she helped nurture in the captains. "Yeah, well, it's not like it's hard to befriend him," Ping said. "It started out rough at first when he..." Tai Li saw the minute winces, the sudden blankness in the captain's eyes, and the faint slump as an ugly blackness swooped in. "Since we first found him." The icky miasma was forced to the edges as Ping forced herself back into her friendly smile. "But he quickly became one of us, whether we liked it or not. I guess it also helps that he's come up with brilliant ideas that made our lives easier." Mai couldn't hold in her annoyance. "Sounds like a charmer." As if on cue, the air in the mess hall stilled into an eerie turquoise as every soldier suddenly froze and looked to the same point. Tai Li followed their gaze to find AZULA and Xing, the former betraying movements that gave her aura an uncertain, nervous red, while Xing's purple was faded and took a less ugly tone. He was only a bit relieved, and in exchange the princess was only a bit unsure of herself. Tai Li felt a need to know what had gone on in their private meeting. Xing glanced around and nodded to each of his officers, and so Run and Ping got up from the table to join him, but not before they gave a polite "pardon us" before they left. Far better than some of the high-nosed courtiers Tai Li had encountered on the way here, trying to gain AZULA's attention. While AZULA and the officers of the regiment walked off, the awkwardness in the air lingered as Xing walked over to bow too formally at the girls. Interestingly, his eyes never lingered long on Tai Li, contrary to many people she'd met, nor did they struggle to look past her as others tried to. His gaze was direct and a bit intense, but with how agitated his aura was, Tai Li couldn't blame him. His eyes were forcing themselves to look straight, his lips parted and closed ever so slightly. The guy was conflicted with something for sure. Or maybe some things. "I must apologize for the unseemly incident you have both witnessed earlier." I hope it does not color your impression of the Princess Regiment. Yeah, he's being too stiff with them, considering that Tai Li did hear him call AZULA by name earlier. From the way his eyes twitched and his shoulders trembled, it seemed more of a polite thing than any fallout the two had. Which was good, Tai Li supposed. It's all right, she replied brightly. I mean, it's AZULA being AZULA, right? At least no one got too hurt. That elicited an interesting wince from Xing, but he simply nodded. I'm sure that you would have better things to do than loiter in a military barracks. So I must ask for your patience as the princess has a meeting with her regiment. It's not that bad, Mai actually said. Better than being stuck in town. Then Tai Li saw the pinkness at the edges of her aura, and she had to suppress a teasing smirk. Returning back to Xing, the acrobat smiled again and waved him off. Don't worry, we've been in courts before, we know what it's like. Thank you for your consideration. Perhaps we'll have a more appropriate socializing after this is done. Xing gave another bow, and then turned to leave. The girls quietly left the mess hall to try and follow him. Because AZULA's own bodyguards politely intercepted them as soon as they stepped out and ushered them to a waiting room. Mai was about to protest with a snide remark, but then they caught sight of Zuko and his uncle, headed towards the same destination as AZULA's group were. The prince looked far better without the bruises, though with the gloomy gray aura draping him one might think that he was headed to the headsman's block. Unfortunately, the bodyguards were very good at their jobs, and Tai Li had to content herself by watching Mai's stew in pink and gray. The meeting was over and done with relatively quickly, and Rin felt rather relieved that it didn't turn out the way her overacting imagination had expected it to. As Kai and the others went to gather the troops into formation again, the training captain glanced over to AZULA, who still wore a frown on her face. Prince Iroh was openly relieved, while the younger prince was torn between grateful relief and self-loathing. Xing was stiff as a board, still wearing his discomfort openly as he led the group back out to the ground's raised stage as the regiment was assembled. Rin would have to speak to him in private again. She hadn't expected her little brother to be so affected in dressing down his subordinates, even if it was barely that. Then again, it was his first time having to do so maybe it's to be expected? No one expects the youngest child to be berating a whole extended family after all, least of all the child themselves. Whether the whole thing was warranted or not would likely be debatable for a while, of course. Rin was too busy with her thoughts on the meeting to pay attention to AZULA's friends appearing and joining the princess, where she quite casually brushed off their questions. Whether you were going to be non-lethal or not is besides the point, Xing had said in a stern but slightly quivering voice. You did not come to me first. Unlike Yuka and the others we've saved, I'm in a position to resolve the matter by myself. He was disappointed and disturbed, but Rin couldn't find the anger in his voice back then. She still couldn't as she replayed his words in her head. Back in the present, she watched Prince Iroh holding a quiet conversation with AZULA. The prince looked regretful as his head shook or nodded along to the princess' replies. Family drama, Rin guessed. Hopefully not related any further with the younger prince. Speaking of, AZULA's friends had wormed their way to the boy's side, and the captain saw how he recoiled a little at the presence of Mai, the forcefully apathetic one. Tai Li, the sunnier and less dressed of the pair, was doing a lot of the talking, but the prince seemed like he was trying to curl away and flee from their presence. Judging by how the girl was moving side to subtly flank him, she probably was aware of that too, with her friends gone to harass her brother. AZULA then drifted towards Xing, and along with Prince Iroh they exchanged words. Nods of varying curtness were exchanged between the three of them, but Rin just felt glad that the kids were still on talking terms. 11th Regiment. Attention! Mosey's voice snapped Rin out of her focus as a couple thousand pairs of feet stomped into sharp attention. She could practically taste the curiosity at the assembly mixed with resentment as the troops spotted the prince who had insulted their colonel. The air was immediately tense, but it slackened when Xing walked up to the stage and turned his right side to the troops. Then the not-so-royal-anymore offender straightened and walked up within nearly parade-perfect steps to stand before Xing, wearing far less desperation than he did in the morning, and then bent over so sharply into a bow that it seemed as if the bone in his spine suddenly disappeared. Colonel Xing, I, Zuko, wish to apologize for the loathsome insult I inflicted on you yesterday. His voice was a little shaky, but the delivery was passable, Rin thought. The compromise to have him declare only his name had a decent effect on the crowd, especially those more acquainted with the formalities of the upper classes. It would be foolish of me to think that such an act could be forgiven so easily. So I can only beg that you will allow me the chance to rebuild the trust that you have so generously granted me before this, and that I have foolishly taken for granted. Ren's lips twitched as she fought back a scowl. Like the others, the prince included, surprisingly, she'd still prefer it if he prostrated himself instead of just bowing. But Xing had been adamant about not making this an utter humiliation. With Prince Iroha's support, and AZULA reluctantly agreeing as well, the officers had to settle with this. Xing let the silence brew for a moment before he replied. The prince still bowed, almost at a perfectly right angle. I will accept your apology, Pete Zuko. The gathered troops reacted rather well to that. The vets in particular losing a lot of their grimness at hearing their colonel finally knocking off some of the undeserved respect for the prince, even if only as a display. With your sister, Crown Princess AZULA's approval and agreement from Prince Iroh, just to rub it in, and Ren wholly agreed with that. AZULA must have coached him on this part. I will allow you a chance to wipe your dishonor against me. As Colonel of the Crown Princess 11th Royal Regiment, I am offering you, Zuko, a chance to earn your honor back by your deeds. You will be inducted into a regiment as an aspiring recruit and undergo every stage of training to determine your worthiness. If you succeed, you will serve in one of the battalions. You will not hold any commissioned rank, and you will fight and bleed for the regiment for as long as I and the Crown Princess deems appropriate. There was a short pause to allow the words to sink in for everyone. There was confusion and uncertainty, but grins broke out in some groups. Rin glanced at her colleagues, and by the nod she received, they noticed it too. They'll have to fix that bit later. Do you accept this offer, Zuko? The prince didn't hesitate, finally straightening from his bow a little to give a sharp salute, never looking Xing in the eyes as appropriate for someone of a lower station. I gladly accept the gracious opportunity you have offered me, Colonel. Xing nodded. Then, recruit Zuko, you will return with Training Captain Ren to undergo training in 4 days' time. Do not waste this opportunity by dropping out or doing anything stupid, like dying from attempting the obstacle courses. That elicited some muted snickers from the troops, but overall the tension had mostly faded off. Thank you, Colonel. Recruit Zuko. The prince looked up with some confusion. You're in my regiment now. Stop bowing like a simpering noble and stand at attention when addressing your superiors. He snapped to attention at a respectable speed. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. That banished more of the tension, and scattered chuckles broke out in the battalions. The soldiers were approving enough of the decision, just as expected. The problem then would be to mold the conscripted prince into something that wouldn't get his comrades killed. Ren sighed, and then marched out to play her part. Recruit, she called out sharply, and the captain felt some satisfaction in seeing a good number of soldiers flinch. Good. She still left an impression on them. The new recruit snapped towards her immediately, and Ren strode up to him. You're mine now, pretty boy, and until we get back, I'm going to put you through your paces. Without further ceremony, Ren grabbed him by the collar and yanked him along with her off the stage. Judging from the looks of commiseration that flashes through some of the crowd, the little act did its intended work. Though it wasn't really an act. Ren promised not to be unfairly harsh on the recruit, but it didn't mean she couldn't enjoy herself. She'll get Kai to use his leave to take care of Fan for the next month or so. Ren would be devoting her full attention to the prince to make sure he was worthy of Xing's kindness.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.